A 22-year-old man marrying a 52-year-old widow wasn't supposed to save his life. It was supposed to end it. That's exactly what Ethan Rowe believed when he stood at that altar, trading his future for his family's survival. But what he didn't know was that his new wife was running from something far more dangerous than shame. Within hours, armed strangers would storm their home. Within days, he'd discover her deadly secret. And within weeks, he'd have to choose between walking away free or standing beside her when the bullets started flying. Stay with me until the very end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this journey travels. The morning Ethan Rowe learned he was getting married, he was shoeing a horse. His hands were black with soot from the forge, sweat cutting clean lines down his dust-covered face. The mare beside him stamped impatiently while he worked the heated iron against the anvil, each strike sending sparks into the dim air of the barn. 22 years old, and he could read a horse's temperament better than most men could read a newspaper. He understood when to push and when to yield, when strength mattered and when patience won the day. He didn't know those same skills would be tested in ways he'd never imagined. "Ethan!" His father's voice cut through the rhythmic clanging. Thomas Rowe stood in the barn doorway, his silhouette framed by the harsh Montana sunlight. Even backlit, Ethan could see the slump in his shoulders, the way his father's hands hung at his sides like dead weight. Ethan set down the hammer. "What is it?" Thomas stepped inside, and the light revealed what the shadow had hidden. Red-rimmed eyes, a face carved hollow by sleepless nights, the look of a man who'd stared into an abyss and found it staring back. "We need to talk about Calvin Drayton's offer." The hammer suddenly felt very heavy in Ethan's hand. He set it down carefully on the workbench, buying himself a moment before he had to face whatever his father was about to say. Calvin Drayton's name had been hanging over their family like a storm cloud for 3 weeks now, ever since Thomas had made the kind of mistake that ended legacies. "I thought we agreed," Ethan said slowly. "We're not selling the ranch." "We're not." Thomas's voice cracked. "But there's another way to settle the debt." The mare sensed the tension and pulled against her lead. Ethan reached out automatically to calm her, his hand steady even as his stomach began to churn. "What way?" His father couldn't meet his eyes. "Drayton's arranged a marriage to Helena Vance, the widow who lives on the north property." For a moment, Ethan thought he'd misheard. The roar of the forge must have damaged his ears. A marriage. It would clear everything, the debt, the interest, all of it. We'd keep the ranch, keep the land your grandfather cleared with his own hands, keep... "A marriage," Ethan repeated, his voice flat. "To Helena Vance." Thomas finally looked at him. "I know what I'm asking." "Do you?" The words came out sharper than Ethan intended. "You're asking me to marry a woman old enough to be my mother because you bet money we didn't have on a hand you couldn't win." His father flinched like he'd been struck. "I know." "The poker game was 3 weeks ago. You've had 3 weeks to tell me this, and you wait until... When's the wedding, Pa? When did you agree to sell your son?" "Saturday." "Saturday?" Ethan laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "This Saturday? 3 days from now?" "Drayton wants it done quickly, legal and binding before I have time to run." Ethan turned away, gripping the edge of the workbench hard enough to make his knuckles white. "Before I have time to think of any other way out of this." The barn fell silent except for the horses breathing and the distant sound of wind moving through the grass outside. Ethan had grown up in this barn. His grandfather had built it with timber cut from their own land, had taught Ethan how to swing a hammer before he was tall enough to reach the anvil without standing on a box. Every beam, every nail, every worn floorboard represented generations of Rowe blood and sweat. And his father had gambled it all away in a single night. "Tell me about her," Ethan said finally, his voice hollow. Thomas cleared his throat. "Helena Vance, widow of Richard Vance, been dead about 2 years now. She keeps to herself mostly. Has that property on the north side, the one with the old oak grove. Some folks say she's educated, maybe even taught school back east before. How old is she?" Silence. "Pa, how old is she?" 52. The number hung in the air between them like an accusation. Ethan closed his eyes. 30 years. She was 30 years older than him. When he was born, she'd already been a grown woman. When he'd taken his first steps, she'd been— She's a good woman, Thomas said quietly. Keeps a clean house, doesn't cause trouble. Drayton says she's agreed to the arrangement, says she needs the protection of a husband's name, and we need to not lose everything. Ethan opened his eyes and stared at the glowing coals in the forge. I know what we need, Pa. I've known every day since you came home that night and told Ma what you'd done. I've watched her cry herself to sleep. I've seen the way you can't look at any of us. I know. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't change anything. Ethan picked up the tongs and pulled the horseshoe from the coals, examining it with an expert eye. Still not quite right. He thrust it back into the heat. Does Ma know? I told her this morning. And? She cried. Then she said if you agreed, she'd support it. But the choice had to be yours. Ethan barked out another laugh. Some choice. Marry a stranger 30 years older than me, or let 3 generations of Rowe legacy get swallowed by Calvin Drayton's land empire. That's not a choice, Pa. That's a noose with 2 ends. But even as he said it, Ethan knew what he was going to do. He'd known from the moment his father had spoken Helena Vance's name, because that was who Ethan Rowe was, the kind of man who'd take the weight of someone else's mistake and carry it without complaint. His grandfather had been the same way. His great-grandfather before that. The Rowes endured. Even when endurance looked like walking into a church on Saturday and promising his life to a woman he'd never met. I'll do it, Ethan said quietly. Thomas's breath rushed out in a shaky exhale. Son, don't. Ethan held up a hand. Don't thank me. Don't apologize again. Just don't. I'll do it because it's the only way to save what we have. But don't ask me to be happy about it. His father nodded, looking older than Ethan had ever seen him. Drayton wants to meet with you tomorrow. Go over the details. Make sure you understand the arrangement. The arrangement? Ethan pulled the horseshoe from the forge and began hammering it again, each strike punctuating his words. Is that what we're calling it? An arrangement? Ethan, get out, Pa. Please. Just get out. Thomas hesitated, opened his mouth as if to say something, then thought better of it. His footsteps retreated across the barn floor, each one echoing in the cavernous space. The door creaked open, flooding the barn with light, then closed again. Ethan kept hammering long after the horseshoe was properly shaped, kept striking the anvil until his shoulder ached and his vision blurred with sweat. Or maybe tears. He couldn't tell anymore. That night, he lay in bed and stared at the ceiling of his small room. Through the thin walls, he could hear his mother's muffled crying and his father's low, comforting murmurs. Ethan had 2 younger sisters, both married off to decent men in neighboring counties. They'd escaped before his father's gambling had spiraled out of control. Ethan had stayed. And now, he'd pay the price for loyalty. The next day dawned clear and cold, the kind of Montana morning that made every breath visible in the air. Ethan rode into town with his father, neither of them speaking. The streets of Copper Falls were busy with the usual weekday traffic, wagons hauling supplies, women shopping at the general store. Men gathered outside the saloon even though it was barely past noon. They all stopped and stared when Ethan rode past. News traveled fast in small towns. Ethan had no doubt every person in Copper Falls already knew about the arrangement, about how Thomas Rowe had gambled away his family's future and how his son was paying the debt in the most humiliating way possible. Calvin Drayton's office sat above the bank, a suite of rooms that spoke of wealth and power. Thick carpets, imported furniture, windows that overlooked the entire main street like a king surveying his domain. Drayton himself stood when Ethan and Thomas entered, his smile sharp as a knife blade. Ethan, good to see you looking so well. Please, sit. Drayton was 55 with silver threading through his dark hair and the kind of confidence that came from owning half a territory. He'd built his fortune buying up struggling ranches, consolidating them into an empire that stretched for hundreds of miles. He was the kind of man who saw opportunities where others saw tragedies, and he'd seen opportunity in Thomas Rowe's desperation. Let's get right to business, Drayton said, settling behind his massive oak desk. The arrangement is simple. You marry Helena Vance this Saturday. The marriage is legal and binding. In exchange, I forgive your father's debt, all $12,000 of it. Ethan kept his expression neutral. And Mrs. Vance has agreed to this? She has. In fact, she suggested it. That caught Ethan off guard. She suggested I marry her? Not you specifically. Drayton waved a hand dismissively. She came to me several weeks ago asking if I knew any young men who might be willing to enter into a marriage of convenience. She has her reasons for wanting a husband. I had your father's debt. It was simple mathematics. Convenience, Ethan repeated. Right. I want to be clear about the terms, Drayton continued. This is a real marriage, legal documents signed and witnessed. You'll live in her home on the north property. You'll be her husband in the eyes of the law and the community. And in reality, Drayton's smile didn't reach his eyes. That's between you and Mrs. Vance. I'm only concerned with the legal arrangements. Whatever domestic understanding you come to is your business. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Ethan wanted to tell his father to leave, to spare himself the humiliation of watching his son be bartered like livestock. But he said nothing. The wedding is Saturday at 2 o'clock, Drayton went on. Small ceremony at the church, just immediate family and witnesses. Mrs. Vance has already made the arrangements. All you need to do is show up and say, I do. That's all? Ethan's voice dripped with sarcasm. Just show up and promise my life away? That's all. Drayton pulled out a document and slid it across the desk. This is the contract. Your marriage to Mrs. Vance in exchange for complete forgiveness of your father's debt. Once you're married, the debt is cleared. Your family keeps their ranch. Everyone walks away with what they need. Except me, Ethan thought. I walk away with a wife 30 years older than me and a reputation that'll follow me the rest of my life. But he picked up the pen and signed anyway. The next 2 days passed in a blur of grim preparation. His mother cleaned his only good suit, the one he'd worn to his sister's weddings. His father avoided him entirely, disappearing into the barn for hours at a time. Ethan went through the motions of ranch work, feeding the horses, mending fence line, fixing the loose board on the porch step. Normal tasks for an abnormal week. On Friday evening, Ethan's mother found him sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. May I join you? She asked softly. Ethan nodded, and she settled into the chair beside him. Martha Rowe was 50 years old, with gray threading through her brown hair and the weathered hands of a woman who'd spent her life working beside her husband. She'd always been the steady center of their family, the calm in every storm, until the storm became too big to weather. I won't pretend to know what you're feeling, she said after a long silence. But I want you to know that your father and we know what you're doing, what you're sacrificing. Do you? Ethan didn't look at her. Do you know what it's like to walk into town and see people whispering? To know that every single person in Copper Falls is talking about how Thomas Rowe sold his son to save his land? They're not talking about that. No? Ethan finally turned to face her. What are they saying, Ma? That I'm noble? That I'm brave? Or are they laughing at the boy who's marrying a woman old enough to be his mother? Martha's eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry. Everyone's sorry. Ethan stood abruptly, needing to move, to do something with the anger and frustration churning in his gut. But sorry doesn't change anything. Tomorrow I'm getting married to a stranger, a woman I've never even met, and everyone will be watching and judging, and she's a good woman, Martha interrupted. Helena Vance. I've spoken with her a few times over the years. She's educated, kind. There are worse fates than marrying someone 30 years older than me who needs a husband for reasons nobody will explain. Ethan shook his head. I'm sure she's perfectly pleasant, Ma. I'm sure she'll be a fine whatever we're supposed to be to each other. But don't ask me to pretend this is anything other than what it is. A transaction. A business arrangement to save us from Pa's mistakes. His mother stood and placed her hand on his arm. You're right, it is a transaction. But Ethan, sweetheart, you're 22 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. Maybe this arrangement won't be permanent. Maybe in time. In time what? She'll die and set me free? The words came out cruel, and Ethan immediately regretted them. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. No, you're right to be angry. You have every right. Martha squeezed his arm. But I also know my son. You're doing this because you're honorable, because you believe in family and duty and protecting what matters. Those qualities won't disappear just because you're angry. They're part of who you are. Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to rage against the unfairness of it all, but he was tired, bone-deep exhausted from carrying the weight of everyone's expectations and his own crushed dreams. "I should get some sleep," he said instead. "Big day tomorrow." His mother kissed his cheek, and he caught the scent of the lavender soap she always used. For a moment he was a child again, safe and protected in a world that made sense. Then the moment passed, and he was just a man walking toward a future he'd never chosen. Saturday arrived with cruel cheerfulness. Bright sun, clear skies, the kind of perfect autumn day that mocked everything Ethan was feeling. He dressed in his clean suit, his hands fumbling with the tie until his father appeared in the doorway and silently helped him finish it. They didn't speak during the ride to town. The church bells were already ringing when they arrived, a sound Ethan usually associated with joy and celebration. Today it felt like a funeral dirge. The small frontier church was nearly empty. A few witnesses Drayton had arranged, the minister and Ethan's parents sitting in the front pew. No friends, no extended family, just the bare minimum required to make the marriage legal. Ethan stood at the altar and waited. He'd spent 2 days imagining what Helena Vance would look like. In his mind, he'd pictured every variation of widow 30 years his senior, matronly and soft, stern and bitter, fragile and elderly. He'd prepared himself for pity or disgust or resignation. The church door opened. Helena Vance entered alone, and Ethan's prepared reactions evaporated. She wasn't what he'd expected, not even close. Helena Vance was tall, nearly as tall as Ethan himself, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the elegant lines of her face. She wore a simple gray dress, well made but not ostentatious, and she carried herself with the kind of posture that spoke of education and breeding. Her skin showed her age in fine lines around her eyes and mouth, but there was strength in her features, a quiet intensity that commanded attention. But it was her eyes that stopped Ethan cold. Dark brown, almost black. They swept over the small congregation with careful assessment before landing on him. In that gaze, Ethan saw intelligence burning like a banked fire. He saw composure that came from iron will, not peaceful acceptance. He saw fear, carefully hidden, expertly controlled, but unmistakably present. This was not a woman who needed a husband for companionship. This was a woman who needed protection. Helena walked down the short aisle with measured steps, her expression giving nothing away. When she reached the altar, she stood beside Ethan and finally looked directly at him. "Mr. Rowe," she said quietly. Her voice was cultured, with the rounded vowels of an Eastern education. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming." As if he'd had a choice, as if this wasn't the most forced, calculated arrangement either of them had ever entered. But something in her tone, in the slight tension around her eyes, told Ethan she knew exactly how he felt, and she was grateful anyway. "Mrs. Vance," he replied, matching her formality. The minister cleared his throat. "Shall we begin?" The ceremony was mercifully brief. No elaborate vows, no personal touches, just the bare legal requirements spoken in flat procedural tones. Ethan heard himself responding at the appropriate times, heard Helena's clear voice beside him, but the words seemed to come from very far away. "Do you, Ethan Rowe, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" A pause. The weight of every eye in the church pressing down on him, his father's debt, his mother's tears, the ranch that had been in their family for 3 generations. "I do." "Do you, Helena Vance, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Helena's hand trembled slightly where it rested in Ethan's grip. Just a tiny movement, almost imperceptible. But Ethan felt it, felt the fine tremor that spoke of nerves or fear, or perhaps both. "I do. Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." 7 minutes. That's how long it took to tie Ethan's life to a stranger's. 420 seconds to trade his future for his family's survival. Neither of them smiled. The minister produced the marriage certificate, and they signed it with careful precision. Helena's handwriting was elegant, practiced. Ethan's signature looked rough and unpolished beside hers. Drayton stepped forward to witness, his pen strokes bold and satisfied. It was done. "Congratulations," Drayton said, though his smile suggested the word meant something different to him than it did to anyone else present. Mrs. Rowe, Mr. Rowe, I hope you'll both be very happy. Helena's face remained perfectly neutral. Thank you, Mr. Drayton. I believe our business is concluded? Completely concluded. Drayton folded the debt contract and tucked it into his jacket. Thomas, you and I are square. The ranch is yours, free and clear. Ethan's father nodded, unable to meet anyone's eyes. His mother was crying quietly, though whether from relief or sorrow, Ethan couldn't tell. I have a wagon outside, Helena said, addressing Ethan directly for the first time since the ceremony. If you have belongings to collect, I can wait while you retrieve them. The businesslike tone should have irritated him. Instead, Ethan felt oddly grateful for it. At least she wasn't pretending this was anything other than what it was, a transaction between strangers bound by necessity rather than affection. I have a bag at my parents' ranch. It won't take long. Of course. Helena turned to the minister. Thank you for your service. She swept out of the church with the same measured grace she'd entered with, leaving Ethan standing at the altar in a suit that suddenly felt too tight, too formal, too much like a costume for a role he'd never auditioned for. His mother approached slowly, her handkerchief twisted between her hands. Ethan, I'm all right, Ma. The lie came easily. I should go get my things. Helena, Mrs. Rowe, is waiting. Saying her name with his last name attached felt wrong, like wearing someone else's boots. The ride to his parents' ranch was silent except for the creak of wagon wheels and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. Helena handled the reins with practiced ease, guiding the horses with subtle movements that spoke of long experience. Ethan watched her from the corner of his eye, trying to reconcile the elegant, controlled woman beside him with the vague, uncomfortable ideas he'd had about what this marriage would mean. She didn't look at him, didn't make small talk or attempt to bridge the awkward chasm between them. She simply drove, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, her expression giving nothing away. At the ranch, Ethan collected the single bag he'd packed, clothes, a few personal items, the small knife his grandfather had given him when he turned 16. Everything he owned fit into one canvas bag. 22 years of life, reduced to artifacts that could be carried in two hands. His mother tried to hug him goodbye, but Ethan kept it brief. If he let himself feel too much now, he'd break. And breaking in front of Helena Rowe, he corrected himself, would only make everything worse. His father stood on the porch, a shadow of the strong man Ethan had grown up admiring. They looked at each other for a long moment, 1,000 unsaid words hanging between them. Then Ethan turned away and climbed back into the wagon. Helena didn't ask if he was all right. She simply clicked to the horses and turned them north, toward the property that was now, apparently, his home. The landscape rolled past in shades of gold and amber, autumn painting the grass in colors that would have been beautiful if Ethan had been able to appreciate them. Instead, he counted fence posts and tried not to think about what came next. Helena's property appeared after 20 minutes of silent travel, a well-maintained homestead with a 2-story house, a barn in better condition than most in the county, and that distinctive grove of old oak trees that gave the place its local name. Oak Grove. Ethan had ridden past it 100 times but had never paid it much attention. Now it was his home. The thought sat in his stomach like a stone. Helena pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and set the brake with practiced efficiency. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she turned to face him directly for the first time since they'd left the church. Mr. Rowe, she began, her voice carefully neutral. Ethan, he interrupted. If we're married, you should probably call me Ethan. A flicker of something, surprise, appreciation, crossed her face. Ethan, then. And you may call me Helena. I think formality between us would be exhausting. Despite everything, Ethan felt the corner of his mouth twitch. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the closest he'd come to one in days. Agreed. Helena nodded and climbed down from the wagon. Let me show you the house. Then we need to establish some ground rules. Ground rules. Of course, even marriage to a stranger required negotiation. Ethan followed her inside and stopped just past the threshold. The exterior of Helena's home had been modest, practical. The interior was a revelation. Books. Everywhere Ethan looked, there were books. Shelves lined the walls of the entry hall, the sitting room beyond it, climbing toward the ceiling with careful precision. Volumes on history, philosophy, literature, science, subjects Ethan barely understood existed. In the corner of the main room sat a polished piano, its wood gleaming in the afternoon light filtering through clean windows. This wasn't the home of a simple frontier widow. This was the residence of someone educated, cultured, with a past that clearly extended far beyond Copper Falls, Montana territory. I wasn't expecting, Ethan trailed off, unable to finish the sentence without sounding ignorant. Books? Helena's tone was dry. Most people aren't. It tends to make them uncomfortable. It doesn't make me uncomfortable. Ethan moved closer to one shelf, reading the spines. Philosophy texts in multiple languages, medical journals, engineering manuals. It makes me curious. Helena studied him for a moment, and Ethan had the distinct impression he was being reassessed. The sitting room is through here, kitchen beyond that. Upstairs are 3 bedrooms and a study. You may have the bedroom at the end of the hall. And you? The master bedroom at the front of the house. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Which brings me to the ground rules I mentioned. Ethan set down his bag and turned to face her fully. I'm listening. Helena stood very straight, her hands clasped in front of her, and Ethan realized she was nervous. Not obviously so. Her voice remained steady, her expression controlled, but there was tension in her shoulders, a tightness around her eyes that suggested this conversation was costing her more than she wanted to admit. First, she began, I want to be clear that I do not expect or require any wifely obedience or domestic servitude from you. This is a marriage of convenience, not, I'm the husband, Ethan interrupted. Wouldn't I be the one demanding obedience? In a traditional marriage, perhaps. Helena's eyes flickered with something sharp. This is not a traditional marriage. I have my own income, my own property. I don't need you to provide for me or make decisions on my behalf. Ethan processed that. Most women in the territory had husbands who controlled everything, money, property, even their daily movements. Helena was drawing a very different arrangement. All right, what else? Second, we will maintain separate bedrooms. I assume Mr. Drayton explained that this marriage is purely legal, not romantic. The word romantic hung between them, laden with all the awkwardness neither of them wanted to address directly. He mentioned it, Ethan said carefully. I'm not here to... I understand what this is. Relief flashed across Helena's face, quickly masked. Good. Then we understand each other. Is there a third rule? Helena hesitated, and for the first time since they'd met, Ethan saw genuine uncertainty in her expression. Yes. Third, you will not ask me questions about my late husband, my past, or why I needed this marriage. I will share what I choose to share, when I choose to share it, but I will not be interrogated. The firmness in her voice told Ethan this wasn't negotiable. It also told him there were secrets here, buried beneath Helena's careful composure. Secrets important enough to marry a stranger to protect. Agreed, Ethan said. On one condition. Helena's eyebrows rose. Which is? You don't ask me why I agreed to this. You don't try to make me feel better about it or pretend it's anything other than what it is. I'm here because my father gambled away our family legacy, and you needed a husband's name for reasons you won't explain. Let's just be honest about that. Something shifted in Helena's expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition of a kindred spirit. That seems fair. They stood in the book-lined sitting room, 2 strangers bound by law and circumstance, negotiating the terms of a life neither of them had chosen. Outside, the autumn sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. I'll show you to your room, Helena said finally. Dinner will be at 6. I hope you're hungry. Ethan wasn't, but he nodded anyway. Thank you. He followed her upstairs, acutely aware of the space between them, careful, measured, maintained. The bedroom she showed him was simple but comfortable, with a good bed, a wardrobe, and a window that looked out over the oak grove. His entire life would fit in this room with space left over. The washroom is across the hall, Helena said from the doorway. Fresh towels in the cupboard. If you need anything. A sharp knock on the front door cut her off mid-sentence. They both froze. It was barely past 4 o'clock. No one made social calls this late in the day, especially not on someone's wedding day. Another knock, harder this time. Urgent. Helena's face went completely white. "Stay here," she said, her voice tight with an emotion Ethan couldn't identify. "Don't come downstairs." But Ethan was already moving, instinct overriding instruction. He'd grown up on a ranch where unexpected knocks meant trouble. Injured livestock, wildfires, raiders. Whatever was at that door, Helena's fear told him it wasn't a friendly visit. He reached the top of the stairs just as Helena opened the front door. 3 men stood on the porch, hard men, with the look of professionals who'd traveled far and fast. Their clothes were dusty from the road, their hands resting on gun belts with practiced ease. The one in front spoke with an accent that definitely wasn't local. "Helena Whitmore?" Ethan saw Helena stiffen at the name. Not Vance, not Rowe. Whitmore. "I'm Helena Brousseau," she said carefully. "I think you have the wrong—" "You're under arrest," the man interrupted, pulling out a federal badge that glinted in the late afternoon light. "For the theft of $50,000 from the Philadelphia Trust and Loan Company. You need to come with us." Ethan's hand went instinctively to his belt, where his knife usually hung. But he'd left it upstairs with his bag, and now he stood frozen on the landing, watching 3 armed men accuse his wife of being a thief. His wife of less than 3 hours. Helena's composure didn't crack, but Ethan could see her hands trembling where they gripped the doorframe. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, gentlemen. My name is Helena Rowe, née Vance. I've lived in Montana Territory for 4 years. I've never been to Philadelphia in my life." The lead man pulled a folded paper from his jacket. "Federal warrant says otherwise, Mrs. Whitmore. Says you embezzled $50,000 from your employer and fled west to avoid prosecution. Now, you can come peacefully, or we can make this difficult." "Let me see that warrant." Helena's voice had taken on a different quality. Sharp, educated, the tone of someone accustomed to reading legal documents and finding their flaws. The man handed it over with obvious reluctance. Helena scanned it quickly, her eyes moving with the practiced speed of someone who knew exactly what to look for. Ethan saw her pause, saw something flicker across her face. "This warrant is for Helena Whitmore of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania," she said carefully. "I am Helena Rowe of Copper Falls, Montana Territory. Different name, different person. You saying you're not Helena Whitmore?" The second man spoke now, his voice carrying a hint of mockery. "Because we have it on good authority that Richard Vance's widow matches the description exactly. Dark hair, tall, educated, ran from Philadelphia after stealing from Martin Grayson's bank." Martin Grayson. The name meant nothing to Ethan, but he saw Helena's knuckles go white where she gripped the warrant. "I don't know who Martin Grayson is," Helena said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. "And I haven't stolen anything from anyone." The lead man sighed. "Ma'am, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. But you're coming with us, one way or another. Federal warrant means we have authority to—" "She's not going anywhere." Ethan's voice surprised even himself. He descended the stairs slowly, deliberately, keeping his hands visible but his posture firm. 3 armed men against 1 unarmed ranch hand weren't good odds, but Ethan had spent his life reading situations, knowing when to push and when to yield. This felt like a moment to push. The men turned to look at him with varying degrees of irritation and amusement. "And who might you be?" the lead man asked. "Ethan Rowe, her husband." The word still felt strange in his mouth, but Ethan invested it with all the authority he could muster. "We were married this afternoon. The certificate is right there on the table, signed by a minister and witnessed by Calvin Drayton himself." "How convenient." The third man, who'd been silent until now, spoke with open skepticism. "Married just today, and here we show up with a warrant. Almost like she knew we were coming. Almost like this territory requires women to have a husband's protection to own property legally," Helena said quietly. "Which I've explained to you is why I remarried after my first husband's death. Not because I'm a fugitive." The lead man studied the marriage certificate, his expression thoughtful. This is real recent indeed. Is there a law against getting married quickly? Ethan moved to stand beside Helena, close enough to present a united front, but not so close as to seem possessive. Because if there is, you might want to arrest half the territory. Folks out here tend to move fast when it comes to practical matters. A tense silence filled the entry hall. The three men exchanged glances, clearly recalculating their approach. Ethan could see them weighing their options, force their way in and risk an incident with a newly married couple, or retreat and regroup with more information. "Look," the lead man said finally, his tone shifting to something almost conciliatory. "Nobody wants trouble here, but we have a job to do, and that job is bringing Elena Whitmore back to face charges. Now, maybe you're telling the truth and this is all a big misunderstanding, but we're going to need proof." "What kind of proof?" Helena asked. "Documentation. Papers showing you've been Helena Vance, living in Montana for the past 4 years. Property records, tax receipts, anything that establishes you weren't in Philadelphia stealing from the Philadelphia Trust and Loan." Helena's jaw tightened. "And if I can provide such documentation, then we'll apologize for the inconvenience and be on our way." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "But until then, I'm afraid we can't just take your word for it. You understand." Ethan saw the trap immediately. Helena would have to produce records, which meant opening up her entire past to scrutiny. And given her reaction to the name Elena Whitmore, given the fear Ethan had seen in her eyes, he suspected her past contained exactly the kind of secrets these men were looking for. "How long do we have?" Ethan asked. "Sir, this isn't really—" "How long?" Ethan repeated, harder this time. "You're asking my wife to gather 4 years of documentation on her wedding day. That seems like a reasonable request requires reasonable time to fulfill." The three men consulted in low voices. Finally, the lead man nodded. 24 hours. We'll be staying at the hotel in Copper Falls. You bring us proof by this time tomorrow, and we'll review it. Fair enough?" "Fair enough," Helena said, though her voice suggested it was anything but fair. The men turned to leave, but the lead man paused on the porch. "One more thing, Mrs. Rowe. Don't think about running. We'll have people watching the roads, and if you are Elena Whitmore, well, running will just confirm it." They mounted their horses and rode off toward town, leaving dust hanging in the still air. Ethan and Helena stood in the doorway, watching until they disappeared from view. Only then did Helena's composure finally crack. She sagged against the doorframe, one hand pressed to her mouth, her breathing sharp and shallow. "Helena, don't." She held up a trembling hand. "Please, just give me a moment." Ethan gave her space, stepping back into the entry hall while she composed herself. He counted to 30 slowly, giving her time to rebuild whatever walls had just crumbled. When she finally turned to face him, her expression was carefully neutral again, but her eyes were red-rimmed. "I suppose you have questions," she said quietly. "About 100 of them." Ethan crossed his arms. "Starting with, are you Elena Whitmore?" Helena walked past him into the sitting room and poured herself a glass of water from a pitcher on the side table. Her hands shook so badly that water sloshed onto the polished wood. She stared at it for a moment, then set the glass down untouched. "Yes," she said finally. "I was Elena Whitmore, a long time ago." The admission hung between them like a physical thing. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, not quite betrayal, since they'd only been married a few hours, but definitely the confirmation that this arrangement was more complicated than even he'd imagined. "Did you steal $50,000? "No." Helena turned to face him, and her voice carried absolute conviction. "I did not steal anything, but I did take something that Martin Grayson wants back very badly." "What?" Helena hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. She moved to the bookshelf and pulled out a thick volume on agricultural techniques. Behind it, cleverly concealed in a hollow cut into the shelf itself, was a leather-bound journal. "This," she said, holding it up. "I took this." Ethan stared at the journal. It looked old, well used, filled with page after page of cramped handwriting. "What is it?" "Evidence." Helena clutched the journal to her chest. "Evidence of the largest land fraud scheme in the territory's history. Evidence that Martin Grayson, respected financier and pillar of Philadelphia society, has been stealing federal funds meant to help settlers for the past 6 years. The words came out in a rush, like poison she'd been holding in too long. Ethan felt his world tilt slightly. He'd expected maybe a messy divorce, or debts, or some scandal involving her late husband. He hadn't expected federal fraud. "Start from the beginning," he said, "and tell me everything." Helena sank into one of the chairs by the window, the journal still pressed against her like a shield. "My first husband, Richard Vance, that was his real name at least, worked as a clerk for the Philadelphia Trust and Loan Company. Martin Grayson owned the bank. On the surface, Grayson was respectable, legitimate, but Richard started noticing discrepancies in the accounts." "What kind of discrepancies?" "Federal grants meant for territorial development, money for schools, wells, irrigation systems, were being diverted. Grayson would approve legitimate loans to settlers, but the money never arrived. Instead, it went into private accounts controlled by Grayson and his associates." Ethan processed that. "How much money are we talking about?" "In 6 years? Nearly $300,000. Helena's voice was hollow. "Money that should have built schools across 3 territories. Money that should have helped families like yours establish ranches, dig wells, survive their first winters. Instead, it went into the pockets of men who already had more than they needed. And your husband documented all of this in that journal." "Yes, every discrepancy, every diverted payment, every false claim. Richard was meticulous. He spent 2 years gathering evidence, and he was planning to take it to federal authorities." Helena's hands tightened on the journal. "Martin Grayson found out." The way she said it made Ethan's stomach drop. "What happened to Richard?" "Official story? He had a heart attack while working late at the bank. 38 years old, perfectly healthy, just dropped dead at his desk." Helena's voice was flat, emotionless. "Convenient timing, wasn't it? The very week he told me he had enough evidence to bring charges." "You think Grayson killed him?" "I know Grayson killed him. I just can't prove it." She looked down at the journal. "But I could prove the fraud. So I took Richard's journal and I ran. Changed my name, married a rancher heading west, started over as Helena Vance." Ethan moved to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. The oak grove looked almost sinister now, shadows lengthening like grasping fingers. "Why not just go to the authorities yourself? Why run?" "Because Grayson owns the authorities." Helena's laugh was bitter. "Judges, marshals, politicians, half of Philadelphia's power structure is in his pocket. I tried going to a federal prosecutor I thought I could trust. 2 days later, my house was ransacked and I was served with embezzlement charges. $50,000 I supposedly stole from the bank. Let me guess. You never touched a dime. Not a single cent. But Grayson had documentation saying otherwise. My signature on transfer papers I never signed. Account statements showing deposits to accounts I didn't know existed. He built an entire case against me while simultaneously positioning himself as the victim." Helena set the journal on the table between them. "So I ran. And I've been running for 4 years. But the pieces were falling into place now. The hasty marriage to a stranger. The 3 rules, especially the one about not asking about her past. Helena hadn't needed a husband for companionship or financial support. She'd needed legal protection, a new identity that couldn't easily be connected to Elena Whitmore. "Those men who came today," Ethan said slowly, "they're not really federal marshals, are they?" Helena shook her head. "I recognized the lead man. His name is Samuel Cord. He works for Grayson as a fixer, someone who handles problems that need to disappear. The badge is probably real enough, but the warrant is Grayson's doing. He's finally tracked me down." "After 4 years? Why now?" "Because people are starting to ask questions." Helena stood and began pacing, energy replacing the earlier shock. "The territorial governor is conducting an audit of federal development funds. Grayson can bury evidence, silence witnesses, but if that journal surfaces during an official investigation, everything falls apart. He needs it back, which means he needs me. Dead? Probably, or at least discredited so thoroughly that anything I say can be dismissed as the ravings of a convicted thief." She stopped pacing and looked directly at Ethan. I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you signed up for. If you want to leave, if you want to tell them I'm Elena Whitmore and wash your hands of this whole mess, I would understand. Ethan considered that. He'd married Helena to save his family's ranch, to clear his father's debt. He'd expected awkwardness and discomfort, maybe even a lifetime of quiet resentment. He hadn't expected to be dragged into a federal fraud case involving murder and corruption. Walking away would be smart, sensible, the safe choice that wouldn't complicate his already complicated life. Do you have proof? He asked instead. Real proof that Grayson diverted those funds? Helena picked up the journal and handed it to him. Read it yourself. Ethan opened the journal to a random page. The handwriting was small but precise, each entry dated and cross-referenced. He saw account numbers, names, amounts transferred versus amounts recorded. He saw discrepancies highlighted in different colored inks, annotations explaining the fraud in detail. Page after page of meticulous documentation, building an undeniable case against Martin Grayson and his associates. This is incredible, Ethan breathed. This could bring down half of Philadelphia's banking establishment. It could, Helena's voice was careful, if it reaches the right people. If I live long enough to testify, if Grayson doesn't destroy it first, then we need to make sure it reaches the right people. Ethan closed the journal. And we need to make sure you live long enough to see it through. Helena stared at him. You're going to help me. You're my wife. The word came easier this time. Those men threatened you on our wedding day, in our home. Whatever else this marriage is or isn't, I'm not going to stand by and let them drag you off to face false charges. Something shifted in Helena's expression. Surprise, gratitude, maybe the first hint of trust. You don't have to do this, Ethan. This isn't your fight. Neither was my father's debt, but I married you anyway. Ethan set the journal down carefully. Besides, you said that money was supposed to help families like mine, build schools, dig wells. If Grayson stole that from people who needed it, then yes, it is my fight. Helena's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. We still need to figure out what to do about those men coming back tomorrow expecting proof that you're not Elena Whitmore. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. Can you produce documentation? Some. I have property records in Helena Vance's name, tax receipts. But nothing from before 4 years ago. Nothing that proves I wasn't in Philadelphia before then. What about witnesses? People who knew you as Helena Vance when you first arrived? Helena nodded slowly. The man who sold me this property, Jacob Morrison. He's dead now, but his widow Sarah might remember. And the minister in town married Richard and me when we first arrived. He could testify that I was already Helena Vance back then. Would he? I don't know. We weren't close. Richard kept to himself, and after he died, I kept even more to myself. She looked troubled. People in Copper Falls know me as the quiet widow who reads too much and keeps strange hours. I don't have many allies. Ethan thought about the town's reaction to his wedding, the whispers and stares. We need more than property records and maybe a minister's testimony. We need something that makes those men doubt their warrant entirely. Like what? An idea was forming in Ethan's mind, risky and potentially dangerous. Like a reason why Martin Grayson would want to frame you, like evidence of the fraud that made you run in the first place. Helena shook her head immediately. No, absolutely not. If we reveal that journal now, Grayson will know exactly where I am and what I have. He'll send more than 3 men next time. I'm not talking about revealing it. I'm talking about using it to build leverage. Ethan picked up the journal again. These account numbers, these names, some of these people might not know they're involved in fraud. They might think they're processing legitimate transactions. So if we can contact one of them, show them what's really happening, we might get someone willing to testify against Grayson, someone whose word carries more weight than a woman accused of embezzlement. Helena was quiet for a long moment, considering. There was a clerk, Thomas Brennan. He processed most of the diverted payments without knowing what they were. Richard thought he was honest, just following orders. Where is he now? Still in Philadelphia as far as I know, working at the same bank. Helena's expression was troubled. But Ethan, contacting him would be incredibly dangerous. If Grayson finds out, Grayson already found you. Those men aren't going away just because we show them some property records. They'll keep digging, keep pushing, until they either arrest you or... Ethan didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what the alternative was. Helena moved to the window, staring out at the oak grove that was now completely dark except for the faint moonlight filtering through the branches. There's a telegraph office in Copper Falls. We could send a message to Brennan, but it would be risky. Telegraph operators read everything. Then we'll code it, make it sound like a business inquiry or a personal message. Ethan joined her at the window. We have 24 hours. That's not much time to build a defense, but it might be enough to plant doubt. And if it doesn't work, then we figure out our next move. Ethan looked at her reflection in the dark glass. But I'm not letting them take you without a fight, Helena, whatever happens. She turned to face him fully, and in the lamplight, Ethan could see the exhaustion in her features, the weight of 4 years spent running and hiding. Why are you doing this? Really? Is it just about the stolen development funds? Ethan considered the question carefully. In the space of 3 hours, he'd gone from resenting this marriage to defending the woman he'd been forced to wed. It didn't make sense, not logically. But standing there in her book-lined sitting room, looking at someone who'd sacrificed everything to expose corruption and protect evidence of massive fraud, he found his answer. Because it's the right thing to do, he said simply. And because I spent the last 3 days feeling like I had no choice in anything. But this? Helping you fight back against men who think they can buy and intimidate their way through life? That's a choice I'm making freely. Helena's smile was small but genuine. You're not what I expected, Ethan Rowe. Neither are you, Mrs. Rowe. They stood together in the gathering darkness, two strangers bound by a forced marriage who'd somehow become allies in the span of a single crisis. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the oak grove with a sound like whispered warnings. We should eat something, Helena said finally. I doubt either of us will sleep much tonight, but we should at least try to keep our strength up. Ethan's stomach rumbled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since a hasty breakfast that morning. That sounds good. Helena led him to the kitchen, which was as well appointed as the rest of the house. She moved through the space with practiced efficiency, pulling out bread, cheese, and cold chicken from the larder. They ate in silence, both lost in their own thoughts about the impossible situation they were facing. As Ethan finished his third piece of bread, Helena suddenly spoke. There's something else you should know about the journal. Ethan looked up. What? Richard made copies. Not complete copies, but summaries of key evidence sent to trusted colleagues. Insurance, in case something happened to him. Helena's expression was grim. After he died, I tried to contact them. 3 of them were dead within a month. Accidents, according to the official reports. And the others? Disappeared. Changed their names, moved west, went underground. She met his eyes. Martin Grayson doesn't leave loose ends, Ethan. If he's sent men here, it means he's decided I'm a loose end that needs to be tied off permanently. The implication settled over Ethan like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about avoiding arrest or clearing Helena's name. This was about survival against a man with the resources and ruthlessness to eliminate anyone who threatened his empire. Then we don't just need to convince those men you're not Elena Whitmore, Ethan said slowly. We need to make it impossible for Grayson to come after you at all. How? Ethan thought about the journal, the evidence it contained, the power it represented. By making sure that if anything happens to you, everything in that journal becomes public immediately. By creating a situation where you're more valuable alive than dead. Helena's eyes widened. A dead man's switch. Exactly. We need to get copies of that journal to people Grayson can't reach, federal prosecutors, newspaper editors, maybe even the territorial governor. And we need Grayson to know that we've done it. That way, killing you or making you disappear doesn't solve his problem anymore. It makes it worse. That would work. Helena's voice carried a note of hope for the first time since the men had appeared at her door. But we'd need time to make copies, to get them distributed safely. Time we don't have. Then we buy time. Ethan stood, the beginnings of a plan forming. Tomorrow, we go to town and provide those men with just enough documentation to make them hesitate. Property records, witness statements, anything that creates reasonable doubt. While they're reviewing it and checking with Grayson, we use that window to get the journal copied and distributed. It's risky. Everything about this situation is risky. Ethan began pacing, energy replacing the exhaustion he'd felt earlier. But doing nothing is riskier. Those men aren't going to give up just because we show them a few papers. Eventually, they'll either arrest you on that warrant or they'll stop pretending to be lawmen and handle things more directly. Helena stood as well, moving to the kitchen window. There's a printing press in Copper Falls. The newspaper editor, Walter Green, he's honest as far as I know. If we could convince him to help, would he? I don't know. He publishes stories critical of the territorial government sometimes, which suggests he's not entirely bought off. But asking him to go against someone like Martin Grayson? She shook her head. That's asking him to risk everything. Then we make it worth his while. Ethan joined her at the window. We give him the story of a lifetime. Corruption, fraud, murder, the kind of story that makes careers and wins awards. Reporters are supposed to expose wrongdoing, right? We just need to convince him that this is wrongdoing worth exposing. They discussed details late into the night, planning their approach, identifying potential allies and obstacles. By the time the clock struck midnight, they had the outline of a strategy, fragile, dependent on too many variables, but better than nothing. You should get some rest, Helena said finally. Tomorrow is going to be difficult. Ethan nodded, though he doubted he'd sleep. You too. They stood awkwardly in the kitchen, the weight of the day finally catching up with both of them. They were married, legally bound, but still strangers in most ways that mattered. The crisis had forced them into an alliance, but it hadn't erased the fundamental awkwardness of their situation. Ethan, Helena said as he turned to leave, thank you for everything. For not walking away when you had every reason to. We're in this together now, Ethan replied. For better or worse, right? That's what we promised today. A ghost of a smile crossed Helena's face. I don't think either of us imagined worse would arrive quite so quickly. Neither did I, but here we are. Ethan made his way upstairs to the bedroom that was supposedly his now. He lay on the bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through everything that had happened. This morning he'd been a ranch hand preparing for a humiliating marriage of convenience. Tonight he was harboring a fugitive accused of embezzlement, planning to expose a federal fraud scheme, and preparing to face down men who'd killed to keep their secrets safe. His life had changed completely in the span of 12 hours. And somewhere in Philadelphia, Martin Grayson was probably receiving word that his men had found Elena Whitmore, that she'd remarried and was claiming to be someone else, that she still had the journal. Ethan wondered what Grayson's next move would be. More men? Legal pressure? Direct violence? Whatever it was, they'd need to be ready. Through the walls, Ethan could hear the faint sound of Helena moving around in her room. He wondered if she was as unable to sleep as he was, if she was lying awake contemplating all the ways their hastily assembled plan could fall apart. Eventually, exhaustion won over anxiety, and Ethan drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with dreams of burning documents and men with badges that gleamed like knives. He woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee brewing downstairs. For a moment, he forgot where he was, forgot everything that had happened. Then memory crashed back, and he was on his feet, pulling on his boots and heading downstairs. Helena was already dressed, her hair pulled back severely, her expression focused. She'd laid out various documents on the dining table, property deeds, tax receipts, letters of reference from the town's general store owner. I've been going through everything I have, she said without preamble. It's not much, but it's something. Ethan examined the documents. They were all dated within the last 4 years, all bearing the name Helena Vance. Nothing that proved she wasn't Elena Whitmore, but enough to create the appearance of an established identity. We need to visit Sarah Morrison, Helena continued, Jacob's widow. If she'll write a statement confirming that she knew me as Helena Vance 4 years ago, that adds weight to our case. And the minister? Reverend Collins. I'll ask him as well, though I'm not confident he'll help. He's cautious about getting involved in anything controversial. They ate a quick breakfast, then hitched up the wagon for the ride into town. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that made the territory look like something from a painting. Under different circumstances, Ethan might have enjoyed it. As they rode, Helena seemed to come to some internal decision. There's something else you should know. About Richard. Ethan glanced at her. What about him? He wasn't what people here thought. The rancher heading west to make his fortune. Helena's hands tightened on the reins. He was a drunk. A mean drunk. The kind who could be charming in public and terrifying in private. The revelation hung in the air between them. Ethan processed it carefully, understanding blooming. Is that why you had those rules? About separate bedrooms and not asking about your past? Partly. Richard saw my education as a threat, my opinions as challenges. He wanted a wife who'd be silent and obedient, and when I wasn't, she trailed off, but Ethan could fill in the blanks. I'm sorry. Don't be. He's dead, and I'm free of him. Or at least I was, until his work came back to haunt me. Helena's smile was bitter. Ironic, isn't it? The one good thing Richard ever did was document Grayson's fraud, and it's the thing that might get me killed. They rode in silence for a while, each lost in thought. As they approached Copper Falls, Ethan could see the hotel where Cord and his men were staying. 3 horses tied up outside suggested all of them were still there, probably planning their next move. We'll handle the documents first, Ethan said. Then we talk to Walter Green about the journal. Helena nodded, her jaw set with determination. Whatever happened next, they'd face it together. Sarah Morrison lived in a small cottage on the east side of Copper Falls, a neat white structure with window boxes that had been recently painted despite the advancing season. Helena had sent word ahead through a neighbor boy, so Sarah was expecting them when they arrived just after 9 o'clock. The woman who opened the door was in her 60s, white-haired and frail-looking, but her eyes were sharp as she studied Ethan and Helena on her doorstep. Mrs. Rowe, Sarah said, and there was something pointed in the way she emphasized the new surname. And this must be your husband. Word travels fast in small towns. Mrs. Morrison, thank you for seeing us. Helena's voice was carefully polite, but Ethan could hear the tension underneath. I know this is unusual, but I need your help with a matter that's become rather urgent. Sarah stepped aside to let them enter. Her parlor was small but immaculate, filled with the kind of carefully preserved furniture that spoke of better days now past. A portrait of a stern-looking man, presumably the late Jacob Morrison, hung over the fireplace. I heard you had visitors yesterday, Sarah said, settling into a worn armchair. Men from back east asking questions about you. About who you really are. Helena and Ethan exchanged glances. The town's gossip network had clearly been working overtime. They've made certain accusations, Helena said carefully. Claims that I'm someone I'm not. I was hoping you might be willing to provide a statement confirming how long you've known me as Helena Vance. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gnarled hands folded in her lap. My Jacob sold you that property 4 years ago this November. You and your husband Richard came through town looking for land to settle on. Jacob showed you 3 properties before you chose the one with the oak grove. Do you remember anything specific about that transaction? Ethan asked. Anything that might help establish the timeline? I remember it was the week before Thanksgiving. Cold already, snow threatening. Richard Vance paid in cash $200 for 40 acres. Jacob thought that was odd, a man that young having that much cash on hand. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. But the money was good, and the deed was signed proper. Helena Vance, it said. Not any other name. Helena leaned forward. Mrs. Morrison, would you be willing to write that down? To sign a statement saying you knew me as Helena Vance from November of 4 years ago? The old woman studied them both, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. Those men who came asking questions, they had badges, federal badges, or so they claimed. Are you in trouble with the law, Mrs. Rowe? No, Helena's voice was firm. But there are people who want others to think I am. People who have reasons to want me discredited or silenced. What kind of reasons? Ethan saw Helena hesitate, weighing how much to reveal. Before she could answer, he spoke up. The kind that involves stolen money meant to help settlers. Money that should have built schools and dug wells, but instead went into the pockets of wealthy men back east. Sarah's eyebrows rose. And you have proof of this? We do, Helena said quietly, which is why those men are here. Not to arrest a thief, but to silence someone who knows too much about their crimes. The parlor fell silent except for the ticking of a clock on the mantel. Sarah looked between them, clearly trying to assess the truth of their claims. Ethan held his breath, knowing that their entire plan depended on people like Sarah Morrison being willing to take a risk for someone they barely knew. "My Jacob was an honest man," Sarah said finally. "Made his living through honest dealings, believed in treating folks fair. He used to say that the worst thieves were the ones who wore fine suits and hid behind big desks." She stood slowly, moving to a small writing desk in the corner. "I'll write your statement. But Mrs. Rowe, if what you're saying is true, if you really do have evidence against powerful men, then you need to do more than just collect witness statements. You need to make that evidence public before those men decide that badges and warrants are too much trouble." "We're working on that," Ethan assured her, "but we need time, and these statements might buy us that time." Sarah pulled out paper and ink, her hand surprisingly steady as she wrote. When she finished, she read the statement aloud. It was brief but specific, confirming the date of the property sale, the names involved, and her ongoing acquaintance with Helena Vance over the subsequent 4 years. She signed it with a flourish and handed it to Helena. "Thank you," Helena breathed, clutching the paper like a lifeline. "You don't know what this means." "I know what it's like to be alone and afraid," Sarah replied. "After Jacob died, there were men who tried to cheat me out of this house, this land. Said a woman alone couldn't possibly manage property on her own. I fought them because Jacob would have wanted me to fight. So you fight too, Mrs. Rowe. Don't let those bastards win." They left Sarah Morrison's cottage with one piece of their puzzle in place. The next stop was Reverend Collins, and Helena's expression suggested she was far less confident about that meeting. The church sat at the center of Copper Falls, a modest wooden structure with a bell tower that had seen better days. Reverend Collins was in his office, a cluttered room filled with biblical texts and correspondence, when they knocked. "Mrs. Vance, Mrs. Rowe, I should say." The Reverend was a thin man in his 50s, with the kind of face that seemed permanently worried. "I heard about your marriage. Congratulations." "Thank you, Reverend." Helena's formality was back in full force. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but I need to ask a favor. It's regarding the marriage you performed for Richard Vance and myself 4 years ago." Collins's expression grew wary. "What about it?" "I need documentation of that marriage, a statement confirming the date, the names, anything you have in your records." The Reverend moved to a filing cabinet and began sorting through papers. "May I ask why? You already have a marriage certificate from that ceremony." "There are men claiming I'm someone other than who I say I am," Helena explained. "They're suggesting I was in Philadelphia 4 years ago, not here in Montana territory. Your records would help prove otherwise." Collins found what he was looking for and pulled out a ledger. "Here it is. November 18th, 4 years ago. Richard Vance and Helena Vance." I remember because it was unusual for a couple to arrive in town already married in name, but wanting the ceremony performed again for the community record. Ethan caught the detail. They were already married? So they claimed. Said they'd had a civil ceremony back east, but wanted a proper church wedding once they'd settled. Collins looked uncomfortable. "I didn't question it at the time. Many couples did similar things when relocating to the territories." Helena's face had gone pale. "I'd forgotten about that detail." "Is it a problem?" the Reverend asked. "It might be," Ethan said slowly, his mind racing. If Helena and Richard had claimed to already be married when they arrived in Montana, that suggested they'd married elsewhere first, possibly in Philadelphia, possibly under different names. That detail could undermine everything they were trying to prove. Helena seemed to reach the same conclusion. "Reverend, would you be willing to provide a statement confirming what you just told us? That you performed a ceremony for Richard and Helena Vance 4 years ago, regardless of whether it was their first or second marriage?" Collins hesitated, his worry lines deepening. "Mrs. Rowe, I don't like to involve the church in legal matters. If these men you're talking about are federal agents—" "They're not," Ethan interrupted. "They're working for a man who's stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from settlers, money that was supposed to build schools, dig wells, help families survive. Instead, it's been lining the pockets of wealthy criminals back east. That's a serious accusation." "We have proof," Helena said. She pulled the journal from her bag. Ethan hadn't even realized she'd brought it, and opened it to a random page. "Look, years of documented fraud, federal funds diverted, falsified records, payments that never reached their intended recipients. My first husband discovered this corruption and was murdered for it. Now the men responsible are trying to silence me before this evidence reaches the authorities who might actually do something about it. Collins stared at the journal, his eyes scanning the meticulous entries. His expression shifted from skepticism to shock to something like anger. This is real? Every word, Helena confirmed. And if those men succeed in arresting me on false charges, this evidence disappears. The fraud continues. More families like the Roes struggle because money that should help them never arrives. The Reverend was quiet for a long time, reading through several pages of the journal. Finally, he closed it and handed it back to Helena. I'll write your statement. But Mrs. Rowe, you need to take this to the territorial governor, or better yet, to the federal prosecutor in Helena. If what you're showing me is accurate, this is far bigger than anything local authorities can handle. We're planning to, Ethan assured him. But first we need to make sure Helena isn't arrested on a false warrant before she gets the chance. Collins nodded and set about writing the statement. Unlike Sarah Morrison's brief confirmation, his was more detailed, including specifics about the ceremony, the witnesses present, and his own observations about the couple at the time. When he finished, he signed it with the seal of the church, adding an extra layer of official weight. Thank you, Reverend, Helena said, her voice thick with emotion. This means more than you know. I hope it helps, Collins replied. But please, be careful. Men who kill to protect their secrets don't stop just because you have a few signed statements. They left the church with 2 pieces of documentation, but Ethan could see the concern in Helena's expression as they walked back toward the main street. The detail about the first marriage, she said quietly. That complicates things. Does it? You and Richard were married. Whether it happened once or twice doesn't change your identity. But it suggests we had something to hide, that we were running from something even back then. Helena gripped the statements tightly. Cord and his men could use that to argue I've been using false identities all along. She wasn't wrong. Ethan could already imagine how the detail would be twisted, how it would feed into the narrative of Helena as a fugitive con artist rather than a widow protecting vital evidence. We stick to the plan, Ethan said firmly. We present these statements along with the property records. It's more than they had yesterday. While they're reviewing everything and checking back with Grayson, we get the journal copied and distributed. Speaking of which, we need to talk to Walter Green. Helena looked toward the newspaper office, a small building squeezed between the general store and the barbershop. And we need to do it before Cord and his men start looking for us. The Copper Falls Gazette operated out of 2 rooms that smelled of ink and paper. Walter Green was at his desk, setting type for what looked like an advertisement when they entered. He was younger than Ethan had expected, maybe 40, with ink-stained fingers and the perpetually distracted air of someone whose mind was always 3 steps ahead of his hands. Mrs. Vance, Green said, looking up. Or is it Mrs. Rowe now? Congratulations on your marriage, though I must say the timing seems precipitous. Mr. Green, we need to speak with you about a matter of considerable importance, Helena said without preamble, and it requires your discretion. The newspaper man's eyes sharpened with interest. I'm listening. Helena glanced around the office. Is there somewhere more private we could talk? Green led them to a back room that served as both storage and a cramped secondary office. Once the door was closed, Helena pulled out the journal for the second time that morning. What I'm about to show you is evidence of federal fraud on a massive scale, she began. Hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen from territorial development funds over the course of 6 years. Money that should have built infrastructure, helped settlers, created schools and wells and roads. Instead, it was diverted into private accounts controlled by a banking magnate in Philadelphia. Green's professional interest was fully engaged now. Go on. Helena opened the journal and walked him through several key entries, explaining the scheme in detail. Ethan watched the newspaper man's expression shift from curiosity to astonishment to barely contained outrage. My husband documented all of this, Helena continued. He was planning to take it to federal authorities when he was murdered. Made to look like a heart attack, but I know better. I took his evidence and ran. I've been hiding for 4 years, but the men responsible have finally found me. They're here in Copper Falls right now, claiming to be federal marshals with a warrant for my arrest on embezzlement charges. Are you Elena Whitmore? Green asked bluntly. I was. I changed my name to Helena Vance when I came west, but I never embezzled a single dollar. The charge was manufactured by Martin Grayson to discredit me and justify hunting me down. Green sat back in his chair, processing everything. This is extraordinary. If it's true, this is the kind of story that could get you killed, Ethan interrupted. The same way it got Richard Vance killed. The same way it got 3 other people who knew about this fraud killed. Martin Grayson doesn't leave loose ends, Mr. Green. If you publish this story, you become a loose end. But if I don't publish it, the fraud continues. Green leaned forward, his eyes bright with the fervor of a man who'd found his calling. Do you know how many families have struggled to get federal assistance out here? How many applications for development funds have been denied or delayed or simply disappeared? If what you're showing me is accurate, this explains everything. It's accurate, Helena said. Every entry is cross-referenced, documented, verifiable. But Mr. Green, we're not asking you to publish it yet. We're asking you to help us copy it, to help us distribute it to people who can act on it, federal prosecutors, the territorial governor, other newspapers. We need to create a situation where this evidence can't be suppressed, where killing me or destroying one copy doesn't solve Grayson's problem. Green was nodding before she finished. A distributed defense. Smart. How many copies do you need? At least 5. 1 for the federal prosecutor in Helena, 1 for the territorial governor, 1 for you to hold in reserve, and 2 others to be distributed to newspapers in larger cities, Denver perhaps, and San Francisco. That's a lot of copying. This journal must be 500 pages. 472, Helena corrected. And yes, it's a lot of work, but it's the only way to ensure the evidence survives, even if I don't. The stark reality of that statement hung in the air. Green looked at Helena with new respect, understanding that this wasn't just about a story or exposing corruption. This was about survival. I have a printing press, Green said slowly. I could set the pages as type and print multiple copies relatively quickly, but it would still take time, days probably. And it would be obvious to anyone who came into this office what I was working on. How long if we helped? Ethan asked. If the 3 of us worked in shifts around the clock if necessary? Green considered. Maybe 2 days. 48 hours if we pushed hard. But that's 2 days where those men you mentioned could decide to stop waiting for documentation and just take you by force. Then we need to make sure they keep waiting. Helena pulled out the statements from Sarah Morrison and Reverend Collins. We're going to give them these this afternoon. Property records, witness statements, enough documentation to create reasonable doubt. While they're verifying everything and checking with Grayson in Philadelphia, which will take at least a day by telegraph, we print copies of the journal. And if they don't wait? Green asked. If they decide the documentation isn't sufficient? Then we make sure at least 1 copy of this journal is already in the hands of someone who can act on it before they make that decision. Ethan was thinking fast now, piecing together a timeline. Today is Sunday. Tomorrow the telegraph office opens, and they can start checking our documentation. That gives us tonight and tomorrow to get at least 1 complete copy made and sent to the federal prosecutor. Helena was nodding. If we work through the night, we could have a full copy by tomorrow afternoon. Send it by express courier to Helena, marked urgent for the federal prosecutor's attention. That's risky, Green warned. Express couriers can be intercepted, especially if Grayson has people watching for exactly that kind of shipment. Less risky than having only 1 copy sitting in my house waiting to be stolen or destroyed, Helena countered. Besides, once that copy is in transit, we can tell Cord and his men about it. Make it clear that arresting me or making me disappear doesn't stop the evidence from reaching federal authorities. Green stood and began pacing, his mind clearly racing through possibilities and problems. This could work, but you need to understand what you're asking. If I help you with this, if I get involved in copying and distributing this evidence, I become a target too. Grayson will come after me the same way he came after you. I know, Helena said quietly. And I wouldn't ask if there was any other way. But Mr. Green, you became a newspaper man to expose the truth, didn't you? To hold powerful people accountable. This is that opportunity. This is the story that defines what journalism is supposed to be. Ethan could see the internal struggle playing out on Green's face, fear warring with professional duty, self-preservation fighting against the chance to make a real difference. It was the same struggle Ethan himself had faced the night before, when he'd had to decide whether to help Helena or walk away. "My wife left me 3 years ago," Green said suddenly. "Went back east to live with her sister. Said she couldn't handle the frontier life, the uncertainty, the constant struggle. I stayed because I still believe, that this territory needs voices willing to speak truth to power. Needs people willing to stand up to the cattle barons and corrupt officials and carpetbaggers who see the West as nothing but resources to exploit." He stopped pacing and looked directly at Helena. "I'll help you. But we do this smart. We protect the evidence first, then we protect ourselves." Relief flooded through Ethan. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. We have a lot of work ahead of us, and no guarantee it'll succeed." Green moved to the door. "Give me an hour to set up the press and prepare the materials we'll need. Come back this afternoon and we'll start copying. But, Mrs. Rowe, you need to deliver those statements to the men waiting at the hotel first. The longer they sit idle, the more likely they are to take direct action." Helena nodded. "We'll go now. They're expecting us by this afternoon anyway." They left the newspaper office with their alliance secured, but Ethan's stomach was churning with anxiety about the next step. Delivering the documentation to Cord and his men meant confronting them directly, giving them a chance to scrutinize every detail and find every flaw in Helena's defense. The hotel lobby was nearly empty when they entered, just a clerk behind the desk and an old man reading a newspaper by the window. Ethan approached the clerk, keeping his voice steady despite his nerves. "We're looking for Samuel Cord and his associates. They're staying here." The clerk's eyes flickered with recognition and something that might have been sympathy. "Room 7, second floor." Ethan and Helena climbed the stairs together, their footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. At room 7, Ethan knocked firmly. The door opened to reveal Cord, looking less official without his coat and badge prominently displayed. Behind him, the other two men sat at a small table playing cards. "Mr. and Mrs. Rowe," Cord said, his tone neutral. "Right on time. Do you have what we asked for?" "We do." Helena held out the folder containing all their documentation, property records, tax receipts, the statements from Sarah Morrison and Reverend Collins. "Everything proving I've been Helena Vance, living in Montana Territory, for the past 4 years." Cord took the folder and moved to the table, spreading the documents out for all three men to review. They examined each page carefully, occasionally consulting with each other in low voices. Ethan watched their faces, trying to read their reactions. Finally, Cord looked up. "This is thorough. I'll grant you that. But it doesn't prove you weren't in Philadelphia before 4 years ago." "It doesn't have to," Helena replied. "Your warrant is for Elena Whitmore, who you claim was in Philadelphia stealing from the Philadelphia Trust and Loan. These documents prove I was here in Montana Territory 4 years ago, establishing property, paying taxes, being witnessed by multiple respectable citizens. The burden of proof is on you to prove I'm the person you're looking for, not on me to prove I'm not." "Fair point." Cord's expression was unreadable. "We'll need to verify these statements with the witnesses, and we'll need to telegraph Philadelphia to confirm certain details about the timing of the alleged theft." "How long will that take?" Ethan asked. "Telegraph office opens tomorrow morning. Figure a day for the message to reach Philadelphia, another day for Grayson's people to respond with verification. So call it 3 days total before we can confirm or deny these documents support your claim." 3 days. They'd hoped for 1, maybe 2. 3 days meant more time in danger, more time for something to go wrong, but it also meant more time to copy the journal and get it distributed. "That seems reasonable," Helena said, her voice steady. "We'll be at our home if you need anything else from us. Actually, Mrs. Rowe, I'd prefer if you stayed in town during this verification period." Cord's tone was polite, but there was steel underneath, "just to ensure you don't decide to relocate suddenly while we're waiting for confirmation." "You're asking us to stay in town so you can keep an eye on us," Ethan said flatly. "I'm asking you to make yourselves available for follow-up questions, should any arise." Cord's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Surely that's not unreasonable, given the circumstances." Helena and Ethan exchanged glances. Staying in town would make it easier to work with Green on copying the journal, but it would also put them under closer scrutiny. Every move they made would be watched. "We can stay at the boarding house," Helena said. "Mrs. Patterson usually has rooms available." "Excellent." Cord gathered up the documents. "We'll be in touch once we hear back from Philadelphia." They left the hotel feeling the weight of surveillance settle over them like a physical presence. Sure enough, when Ethan glanced back from the street, he saw one of Cord's men standing in the hotel window, watching them walk away. "They're not going to let us out of their sight," Helena murmured. "Every move we make, they'll be watching. Then we'll have to be creative about getting to Green's office." Ethan steered them toward the boarding house, maintaining the pretense of normal behavior. "We'll check in with Mrs. Patterson, get a room, then figure out how to slip away after dark." The boarding house was a rambling two-story structure run by a widow who supplemented her income by renting rooms to travelers and temporary residents. Mrs. Patterson was a round, cheerful woman who asked no questions when Helena and Ethan requested a room for several days. "Newlyweds need a bit of time to settle," she said with a knowing wink. "Room 3 just came available. Nice and quiet, away from the street noise." They settled into the small room, which contained a bed, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the back alley. As soon as Mrs. Patterson's footsteps retreated down the hall, Helena moved to the window and examined the view. "There's a back staircase," she noted, "used for deliveries and such. We could slip out that way after dark without being seen from the street." Ethan joined her at the window. "Green's office is 3 blocks over. If we stay in the shadows, keep to the alleys, we might make it without being spotted." "Might isn't good enough. If Cord's men see us sneaking around, they'll assume we're running and arrest us immediately." Helena turned from the window. "We need a better cover story. A reason to be out at night that wouldn't arouse suspicion." They spent the afternoon planning, working out every detail of how they'd reach Green's office undetected. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, they heard a soft knock at their door. Ethan opened it to find a young boy, maybe 10 years old, holding a folded note. "Message for Mrs. Rowe," the boy said, then scampered off before Ethan could ask who'd sent it. Helena unfolded the note, and Ethan saw her expression tighten. She handed it to him without a word. The message was brief, written in Green's hasty scrawl. "Press ready, come after midnight, back door, tell no one." "He's prepared faster than expected," Helena said quietly. "We should eat something, rest if we can, then make our way over when the town's asleep." They went downstairs for dinner, maintaining the appearance of a normal, newly married couple settling into town life. Mrs. Patterson served them roast chicken and potatoes, chattering about local gossip and upcoming events. Ethan made appropriate responses while his mind raced through everything that could go wrong in the hours ahead. After dinner, they returned to their room and waited for midnight. Helena tried to read one of the books she'd brought from home, but Ethan noticed she kept reading the same page over and over, unable to focus. He sat by the window, watching the street gradually empty as businesses closed and residents retired for the night. At 11:30, they saw Cord's men making their rounds, one walking past the boarding house, another stationed near the hotel, a third near the livery stable. They were maintaining watch, just as expected. "We'll give them another hour to settle into their pattern," Ethan whispered. "Then we move." The wait was excruciating. Every sound in the boarding house made Ethan tense, every creaking floorboard or closing door suggesting discovery. But finally, the clock in the downstairs hall chimed midnight. They moved silently, Helena carrying the journal wrapped in cloth, Ethan leading the way down the back staircase. The night was cool and moonlit, providing enough light to navigate, but also enough shadows to hide in. They slipped into the alley behind the boarding house and began working their way toward Green's office, staying close to the buildings, freezing whenever they heard footsteps or voices. It took 20 minutes to cover 3 blocks, but they reached the newspaper office without being spotted. The back door opened at Ethan's quiet knock, and Green ushered them inside quickly. "Any trouble?" the newspaper man asked. "Cord has men watching, but we weren't followed." Helena unwrapped the journal. "How long until we can start?" Green led them to the back room where the printing press had been prepared with fresh type and paper. "I've set up a system. Mrs. Rowe, you read the entries aloud. I'll set them in type. Mr. Rowe, you'll help with the printing once we have enough pages set. We work in 2-hour shifts, taking breaks to avoid exhaustion and mistakes." They fell into the rhythm quickly. Helena's cultured voice reading Richard's meticulous documentation, Green's ink-stained fingers flying across the type, The mechanical rhythm of the press producing page after page of copied evidence. Hours blurred together, marked only by the slowly growing stack of printed pages and the changing position of the moon visible through the high window. At dawn, they heard movement in the street outside. Green immediately stopped the press, and they all froze, listening. Footsteps passed by the front of the building, then faded. One of Cord's men, making his morning rounds. "We need to be more careful during daylight," Green said quietly. "Sound carries differently when the town is awake." They continued working, more cautiously now, muffling the sound of the press with blankets and limiting their conversation to whispers. By mid-morning, they had copied nearly 100 pages, a fifth of the journal, and Ethan's shoulders ached from operating the press. Helena looked exhausted, her voice growing hoarse from hours of reading, but she refused to stop, driven by the knowledge that every copied page was another piece of evidence that couldn't be destroyed, another nail in Martin Grayson's coffin. At noon, Green went out to buy food and gather intelligence about Cord's activities. He returned with bread, cheese, and news that made Ethan's blood run cold. "Cord sent a telegraph to Philadelphia this morning," Green reported. "I have a friend who works at the telegraph office. She said the message was long, detailed, probably including all the information from the documents you provided. They're checking everything." "How long until they get a response?" Helena asked. "Could be tonight, could be tomorrow. Depends on how thorough Grayson wants to be." Green set down the food. "But there's something else. Cord's men were asking around town about the two of you. Specifically, they were asking if anyone had seen you leaving the boarding house late at night." Ethan's stomach dropped. "They suspect we're up to something." "Maybe. Or maybe they're just being thorough." Green looked troubled. "Either way, we need to finish this quickly. Once they get confirmation from Philadelphia, and we know Grayson will confirm whatever serves his purposes, they'll move fast." They ate quickly and returned to work, the urgency lending new energy to their exhausted bodies. The afternoon wore into evening into night again. They worked through their second midnight, the pile of copied pages growing steadily. By dawn of the third day, they had copied 300 pages. Ethan's hands were cramped. Helena's voice was barely a rasp, and Green looked like he might collapse at any moment. But they pressed on, knowing they were running out of time. And then, just after sunrise, they heard it. The sound of multiple horses stopping in front of the newspaper office. Heavy boots on the wooden sidewalk. A sharp knock on the front door. They all froze, staring at each other in the gray morning light. The knock came again, harder this time, and Samuel Cord's voice rang out clearly. "Walter Green, open up. We need to speak with you about your guests." Green moved first, his newspaperman's instincts kicking in. He gestured frantically toward the back room while calling out toward the front door. "Just a moment. I'm not decent." Helena was already gathering the copied pages, her hands moving with desperate efficiency despite their trembling. Ethan grabbed the original journal and the printing plates they'd been using, looking for anywhere to hide them. The back room had no closets, no obvious hiding places that wouldn't be discovered in a thorough search. "The press," Green hissed, buttoning his shirt as he moved toward the front. "There's a compartment underneath for storing spare type. It's meant to hold metal, but paper will fit." Ethan dropped to his knees, finding the hidden panel Green had indicated. It was barely large enough, but he shoved the journal and as many copied pages as would fit inside, then slid the panel closed just as the front door opened. "Mr. Cord," Green's voice carried back to them, professionally pleasant but strained. "This is quite early for a social call." "This isn't social, Mr. Green. We have reason to believe you're harboring fugitives." Helena had pressed herself against the wall beside the doorway to the back room, out of sight from the front office. Ethan positioned himself similarly on the other side, his heart hammering so hard he was certain it would give them away. "Fugitives?" Green sounded genuinely puzzled. "I'm afraid you've been misinformed. I've been working alone all night on a printing job. As you can see, I'm the only one here. Then you won't mind if we search the premises." Ethan heard footsteps, multiple sets, moving through the front office. He met Helena's eyes across the doorway and saw his own fear reflected back at him. They had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. In seconds, Cord's men would round that corner and find them. But then Green spoke again, his voice taking on an edge of indignation. Actually, I do mind. This is a place of business, Mr. Cord, and unless you have a warrant authorizing a search, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Freedom of the press, you understand. Can't have federal agents ransacking newspaper offices on a whim. Tends to make folks nervous about government overreach. The footsteps stopped. Ethan could almost feel Cord weighing his options through the wall, push forward and risk creating a scene that might draw unwanted attention, or back down and maintain the veneer of legitimate law enforcement. We received a telegraph from Philadelphia last night, Cord said finally. From Martin Grayson himself. He confirmed that Elena Whitmore was definitely in his employ 4 years ago, that she had access to bank funds and accounts, that money went missing right around the time she disappeared. And yet, the documents we provided show Helena Rowe was here in Montana Territory 4 years ago, Green countered. Seems like Mr. Grayson's timeline doesn't match the facts. Unless Mrs. Rowe is lying about when she arrived in Montana, unless those witness statements are false, unless the whole thing is an elaborate deception by a woman who's had 4 years to construct a false identity. Cord's voice hardened. Now, Mr. Green, I'm going to ask you one more time. Are Ethan and Helena Rowe in this building? The silence stretched out, broken only by the sound of Ethan's own breathing and the distant clatter of morning activity in the street outside. Green was risking everything by refusing to cooperate, putting himself directly in the crosshairs of men who'd already killed to protect their secrets. They are not, Green said firmly, and unless you produce a warrant, I'm going to have to insist you leave my property. Otherwise, I'll be forced to write a rather unflattering article about federal agents violating the constitutional rights of honest businessmen. More silence. Then Cord's voice, cold with barely contained anger. This isn't over, Mr. Green. We'll be watching this building, and when we do find the Rows, and we will find them, we'll remember who helped them. I'll look forward to reading about it in my competitors' newspapers then. Good day, Mr. Cord. The front door slammed. Footsteps retreated across the wooden sidewalk. Ethan stayed frozen, not daring to move until he heard the sound of horses departing. Even then, he waited until Green appeared in the doorway, his face pale but determined. They're gone. For now. The newspaper man sagged against the doorframe. But they meant what they said. They'll be watching. Helena emerged from her hiding spot, still clutching the pages they hadn't been able to hide. You just made yourself a target, Mr. Green. Cord will tell Grayson that you refuse to cooperate. Let him tell Grayson whatever he wants. I'm not in the business of helping corrupt officials silence witnesses. Green straightened, some of his usual energy returning. But we have a bigger problem now. If they're watching this building, you can't leave without being seen. And we certainly can't continue copying the journal here. Ethan pulled the hidden compartment open and retrieved the journal and copied pages. How many pages do we have? 314, Helena said, her voice raw. Still over 150 pages short of a complete copy. But it's enough, Green said, thinking fast. Enough to show the pattern of fraud, enough to implicate Grayson and his associates, enough to justify a federal investigation. We package what we have, send it to the federal prosecutor and Helena, and hope it's sufficient to trigger action before court arrests you. They'll be watching the stagecoach office, Ethan pointed out, and the telegraph office. Any official shipping method will be monitored. Green moved to his desk and pulled out a map of the territory. There's a mining camp about 15 miles north of here. They have their own courier service running supplies to Helena twice a week. Next run is this afternoon. If we can get the package there, it could reach the federal prosecutor without going through any official Copper Falls channels. How do we get to a mining camp 15 miles away when we're being watched? Helena asked. Before anyone could answer, they heard voices outside. Not Cord's men this time, but the normal sounds of Copper Falls waking up, shopkeepers opening their stores, wagons rattling past, people calling greetings to each other. The town was coming to life, which meant staying hidden in Green's office was no longer an option. We need to get you back to the boarding house, Green said. If Mrs. Patterson notices you're gone, she might mention it to the wrong people. Ethan moved to the window and carefully peered out. The street was busy now, but he didn't see any obvious watchers. If we leave separately, blend in with the morning crowd, we might make it back without being spotted. Take the copied pages with you, Green urged. Split them up, hide them in your clothes. If Cord's men search my office later, I don't want them finding anything that connects me to your cause. Helena divided the copied pages between herself and Ethan, tucking them inside their clothing where they wouldn't be visible. The original journal went back into the hidden compartment in the press, safer there than moving it through the streets. We'll come back tonight, Helena said. Finish the copying and figure out how to get it to that mining camp. No. Green shook his head firmly. They'll be watching for exactly that. You come back here and they'll arrest you on the spot. We need a different approach. Ethan's mind raced through possibilities. They needed to finish copying the journal, needed to get it distributed, needed to do all of this while under active surveillance by men who had the law on their side and murder in their history. What if we don't come back? He said slowly. What if you finish the copying yourself? That would take me at least another full day working alone, Green protested. And the longer we wait, the more likely. Then we don't wait to send what we already have. Ethan was thinking out loud now, the plan forming as he spoke. We get the partial copy to that mining camp today. Get it into the federal prosecutor's hands by tomorrow or the next day. Once it's in official custody, once an investigation is opened, Grayson's power to suppress this diminishes significantly. Helena caught on immediately. And once the prosecutor has evidence of federal fraud, Cord's warrant for embezzlement becomes suspect. They're investigating the very bank I supposedly stole from. My accusations about false charges suddenly carry more weight. Exactly. Ethan turned to Green. Can you get this package to the mining camp without being followed? Maybe. I have a delivery boy who makes runs for me sometimes. Young kid, nobody pays attention to him. If I package the pages as printing supplies being returned to a customer up north. Green was nodding, the pieces coming together. Yes, that could work. Do it. Helena's voice carried new determination. Get those pages to the federal prosecutor today. Then finish copying the rest of the journal and prepare additional copies for backup. If anything happens to us, if court arrests us or worse, at least the evidence will survive. Green moved to his desk and began preparing a package, wrapping the copied pages in brown paper and string. Where should I send additional copies, if I make them? The territorial governor, Helena said immediately. And newspapers in Denver and San Francisco make Grayson's fraud too widespread to contain. They finalized the details quickly. Addresses, cover stories, contingency plans if things went wrong. Then Ethan and Helena prepared to leave, knowing that every moment they stayed in Green's office increased the risk of discovery. One more thing, Green said as they reached the back door. If you're arrested, if they take you before the evidence reaches the prosecutor, don't resist. Don't give them an excuse to use force. Stay alive long enough for that package to arrive and do its work. The advice was sound, but chilling. Don't resist. Stay alive. As if arrest and possibly death were inevitable outcomes they should simply endure while hoping evidence moved faster than violence. We'll be careful, Helena promised. They slipped out the back door into the alley, then separated, Helena heading north toward the boarding house, Ethan circling south before doubling back. The morning crowd provided good cover, and Ethan made it back to their room without seeing any of Cord's men. Helena arrived 5 minutes later, slightly breathless, her eyes bright with adrenaline and fear. I saw one of them, the tall one with the scar. He was watching the boarding house from across the street. Did he see you? I don't think so. I came in through the back, same as you. She moved to the window and carefully looked out. There, by the general store. He's still watching. Ethan joined her, following her gaze. Sure enough, one of Cord's associates stood in a position that gave him clear sight of both the boarding house entrance and most of the main street. They were trapped, effectively under house arrest, without the formality of actual charges. We wait, Ethan said, forcing himself to sound calmer than he felt. We let Green get that package sent north. We act like a normal couple settling into town life. And we hope the federal prosecutor moves faster than Grayson's network of corruption. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. They had breakfast in the boarding house dining room, making small talk with Mrs. Patterson and other guests. They sat in their room and pretended to read while actually watching the street for any sign of activity. They tried not to think about the copied pages hidden in Green's office, about the package being prepared for the mining camp, about all the things that could go wrong. Around 2 o'clock, They saw a young boy, maybe 12 years old, leave Green's newspaper office carrying a wrapped package. He walked with the casual confidence of someone on a routine errand, heading north toward the edge of town. None of Cord's men seemed to pay him any attention. "That's it," Helena breathed. "That's our evidence, heading to the federal prosecutor." They watched the boy disappear from sight, carrying with him their best hope for survival and justice. Now, they just had to wait for it to reach its destination and for someone in authority to take action. But waiting, as Ethan was learning, was its own form of torture. Evening came, and with it a knock on their door. Ethan opened it to find Samuel Cord standing in the hallway, his expression unreadable. "Mr. and Mrs. Rowe, I hope I'm not disturbing you." "What do you want?" Ethan kept his voice level, one hand on the door frame in a position that could block entry if needed. "I wanted to inform you that we've received additional information from Philadelphia, information that raises serious questions about the documents you provided." Cord pulled out a folded telegram. "Martin Grayson has provided bank records showing that Elena Whitmore made withdrawals from company accounts up until 6 months ago. That's 3.5 years after you claim to have been living in Montana Territory." Helena's face went white. "That's impossible. I haven't touched any Philadelphia account since I left." "And yet the records show otherwise. Withdrawals made from various locations across the East Coast, all signed with your name." Cord's smile was cold. "Either you're lying about being in Montana, or someone has been impersonating you for years. Either way, it raises doubts about everything you've told us." Ethan felt rage building in his chest. Or Grayson fabricated those records, just like he fabricated the embezzlement charges. You're accepting the word of a man we've accused of massive fraud without any independent verification. "I'm accepting documented evidence over the claims of an accused criminal." Cord folded the telegram. "Mrs. Rowe, I'm placing you under arrest for embezzlement and flight from prosecution. You'll be transported to Philadelphia to face trial." "No." Ethan stepped forward, putting himself between Cord and Helena. "You're not taking her anywhere. Not without a proper hearing before a territorial judge. Not without giving us a chance to challenge Grayson's so-called evidence." "Federal warrant supersedes territorial jurisdiction, Mr. Rowe. I don't need a local judge's permission." Cord's hand moved to his gun belt, not quite drawing but making the threat clear. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "You're not a federal marshal." Helena's voice was steady despite the fear in her eyes. "You're a hired gun working for a corrupt banker, and if you try to take me out of this territory, you'll be guilty of kidnapping." "Strong words from a woman about to be arrested," Cord gestured, and his 2 associates appeared at the end of the hallway. "Last chance to come peacefully." Ethan's mind raced. They could resist, could fight, but 3 armed men against 1 unarmed man and a woman would end only one way. They could try to run, but where? The boarding house was surrounded, the town was being watched, and they had no allies except Green, who couldn't openly help without destroying his own cover. And then, from downstairs, they heard it. The sound of multiple horses arriving, loud voices, the heavy tread of boots on the boarding house steps, Mrs. Patterson's voice, confused and alarmed. "Gentlemen, this is a respectable establishment. I must ask you to—" "Federal business, ma'am. We're looking for Samuel Cord and his associates." Ethan saw Cord's expression change, saw uncertainty replace confidence. The voice from downstairs was different, official, authoritative, carrying the weight of real governmental power rather than purchased badges. A man appeared at the top of the stairs, and Ethan's breath caught. He wore the unmistakable uniform of a federal marshal. The real thing, not the costume Cord and his men had been wearing. Behind him were 4 more marshals, all armed, all carrying themselves with the professional competence of actual law enforcement. "Samuel Cord," the lead marshal said, "I'm Marshal James Thornton, and I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and attempted kidnapping of a federal witness." The hallway erupted into chaos. Cord's hand went for his gun, but 3 marshals had weapons drawn and pointed at him before he could clear the holster. His associates tried to run, but more marshals were coming up the back stairs, cutting off escape. "Don't move!" Thornton barked. "You're all under arrest. Hands where I can see them." Ethan pulled Helena back into their room as the marshals swarmed Cord and his men, disarming them and snapping handcuffs around their wrists. Through the confusion, Ethan caught fragments of furious conversation. This is a mistake. We have authorization. Your authorization is from a man currently being arrested in Philadelphia for defrauding the federal government. Now shut up and cooperate, or we'll add resisting arrest to your charges. Within minutes, it was over. Cord and his associates were being led downstairs in handcuffs, their protests ignored by the stone-faced marshals. Marshal Thornton remained behind, turning his attention to Ethan and Helena. "Mr. and Mrs. Rowe?" he asked. "Yes," Helena managed, her voice shaking. "I'm sorry for the dramatic entrance. We received a package from a Walter Green earlier today, evidence of a massive fraud scheme involving diverted federal development funds. The federal prosecutor and Helena read it, contacted my office, and we've been riding hard since yesterday evening to get here." Thornton's expression softened slightly. "We also received word that fake marshals were in Copper Falls attempting to arrest you on fabricated charges. Looks like we arrived just in time." "The package arrived already?" Ethan couldn't believe it. "We only sent it this morning." "Express courier, marked urgent. Got to Helena by mid-afternoon. The prosecutor recognized the severity immediately. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen federal funds. He had warrants issued for Martin Grayson and his known associates within 2 hours. Thornton pulled out a chair and gestured for them to sit. "I'm going to need you both to come to Helena and provide full statements. And Mrs. Rowe will need the original journal that was referenced in the copied pages." "It's here in Copper Falls," Helena said. "At the newspaper office, hidden in the printing press. Walter Green knows where." "We'll retrieve it. But I need to know, are there other copies, other people who might have this evidence?" Helena hesitated, and Ethan saw her calculating how much to reveal. Finally, she nodded. "We were in the process of making additional copies when you arrived. We wanted to ensure the evidence couldn't be suppressed if something happened to the original." "Smart thinking." Thornton made a note. "How many copies?" "One complete copy is in that package you received. We have about 150 pages of a second copy, and plans to create 3 more full copies for distribution to other authorities and newspapers." "Good. The more distributed this evidence is, the harder it'll be for Grayson's associates to bury it, and believe me, they'll try." The marshal stood. "I'm going to need you both to come with me now. We have a lot of ground to cover, and time is critical. Grayson was arrested in Philadelphia 4 hours ago, but he has powerful friends. We need your testimony locked in before those friends start applying pressure." They gathered their few belongings, still in shock at how quickly everything had reversed. Less than an hour ago, they'd been facing arrest and possibly death. Now they were federal witnesses in a major fraud case, protected by actual marshals rather than hunted by fake ones. As they descended the boarding house stairs, they found the lobby crowded with curious residents and townspeople who'd heard the commotion. Mrs. Patterson stood near the door, fanning herself dramatically. "I've never had so much excitement under my roof," she declared. "Federal marshals, arrests, and all before supper time." Outside, Copper Falls had turned out in force. News of the arrests had spread like wildfire, and people lined the street to watch Cord and his associates being loaded into a prison wagon. Ethan saw familiar faces in the crowd: Sarah Morrison, Reverend Collins, people who'd helped them when they needed it most. And standing near his newspaper office, watching with a satisfied expression, was Walter Green. He caught Ethan's eye and gave a small nod. Mission accomplished. They were preparing to mount horses for the ride to Helena when a commotion at the edge of town drew everyone's attention. A rider was coming fast, his horse lathered with sweat, waving something that looked like a telegram. "Marshal Thornton," the rider called, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "Urgent message from the federal prosecutor." Thornton took the telegram and read it quickly, his expression darkening. He looked up at Helena, and Ethan felt his stomach drop. "What is it?" Helena asked. "Martin Grayson posted bail 2 hours ago. $10,000 cash, paid immediately. He's currently at large in Philadelphia, with all his resources and connections still available to him." Thornton crumpled the telegram. "The prosecutor is working on getting the bail revoked, but it could take days, maybe longer." The implications hit Ethan like a physical blow. Grayson was free to use his wealth and influence, free to threaten witnesses, free to hire more men like Cord to finish what they'd started. "We're not safe," Helena said quietly. "Even with Cord arrested, even with evidence in federal hands, We're not safe as long as Grayson is free. That's why we're getting you to Helena immediately, Thornton said. Federal courthouse has secure facilities for protecting witnesses. We'll keep you there until the trial. Ensure Grayson can't reach you. How long until trial? Ethan asked. Could be months. Federal cases move slowly, especially complex fraud cases with multiple defendants. Thornton was already organizing his marshals, preparing for departure. But you'll be protected. That's a promise. As they prepared to leave Copper Falls, Ethan looked back at the town that had been his home for less than a week. He thought about the ranch he'd tried to save by marrying Helena, about his family and the debt that had started all of this. None of it seemed real anymore, overshadowed by the larger drama of federal corruption and murder. They rode out as the sun was setting, a group of 8 marshals surrounding Ethan and Helena like a protective shell. Behind them, Copper Falls grew smaller in the distance. Ahead lay Helena, the territorial capital, and whatever came next. But as they rode through the gathering darkness, Ethan noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the tree line to their right, barely visible in the fading light, was a flash of movement. A rider, pacing them at a distance, staying just out of clear sight. One of Grayson's men, still watching, still hunting. Ethan didn't say anything about the rider. Not yet. He watched the tree line as they rode, tracking the shadow that kept pace with their group, and waited to see if Marshal Thornton or his men had noticed. If they had, they gave no sign, maintaining their formation around Ethan and Helena as the last light drained from the sky. They rode for 3 hours before stopping to rest the horses. Thornton chose a spot where the road passed through open ground, nowhere for an ambush to hide, and posted sentries in a wide perimeter. Only then did Ethan approach him quietly. "We're being followed," Ethan said, keeping his voice low. "Single rider, staying in the tree line to the east. Been tracking us since we left Copper Falls." Thornton's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "I know, spotted him about an hour ago. My men have been watching." "One of Grayson's?" "Probably. Could be a scout seeing where we're taking you. Could be waiting for reinforcements." The marshal glanced toward where Helena sat by one of the small fires his men had built. "Either way, he's a problem we need to solve before we reach Helena." "What's your plan?" "Depends on what he does. If he's just watching, we let him watch and make sure we reach the federal courthouse without incident. If he tries something..." Thornton's hand rested on his gun. "We're prepared for that too." They rode on after an hour's rest, pushing through the night. The shadow in the tree line disappeared around midnight, and Ethan didn't know if that was a good sign or a bad one. Either the rider had given up, or he'd gone ahead to set something in motion. Dawn found them approaching a river crossing, a narrow bridge over swift water. Thornton called a halt half a mile out, studying the bridge through a small telescope. "Problem?" one of his marshals asked. "Can't tell. Bridge looks clear, but it's a natural choke point. If I was planning an ambush, that's where I'd do it." Thornton lowered the telescope. "Jackson, take 2 men and scout it. Careful approach. And if you see anything suspicious, fire 2 shots and pull back." 3 marshals rode forward cautiously, while the rest waited, hands on weapons. Ethan felt Helena tense beside him, her eyes fixed on the bridge. Minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Then they heard it. Not gunshots, but voices shouting. The scouts were waving them forward, and Jackson was gesturing emphatically at something on the far side of the bridge. "Stay close," Thornton ordered Ethan and Helena as they rode forward. What they found at the bridge made Ethan's blood run cold. On the far side, arranged deliberately to be seen, was a body. A man, middle-aged, wearing the clothes of a professional courier. His saddlebags lay open beside him, their contents scattered across the road. "Is that..." Helena's voice caught. "The courier from the mining camp," Thornton confirmed grimly. He dismounted and approached the body carefully, checking for signs of life even though it was obviously too late. "Shot twice, close range. This happened recently, maybe 2 hours ago." "They were looking for something," Jackson said, pointing to the scattered papers and personal effects. "Went through everything he was carrying." Helena made a small sound of distress. "The journal pages. The ones we sent to the federal prosecutor." "Already in Helena," Thornton reminded her. "This courier was carrying other packages, other messages. But yes, they were looking for your evidence." Grayson's people knew we'd use the mining camp courier service. Which means they know about the journal, Ethan said. They know we have evidence and they're trying to intercept it before it spreads further. Thornton stood, his expression hard. Get this man wrapped and secured. We'll bring him with us for proper burial. And everyone stay alert. If they killed once this morning, they might be planning to kill again. They crossed the bridge in tight formation, every marshal with weapon drawn, but no attack came. The road stretched empty ahead of them, winding through pine forests and open meadows. Too empty, Ethan thought. Too quiet. Around mid-morning, they spotted riders ahead, not hiding this time, but waiting openly in the middle of the road. 6 men, all armed, all wearing the kind of hard expressions that came from lives spent on the wrong side of the law. Thornton raised his hand, bringing the group to a halt about 50 yards away. "Federal marshals," he called out. "Clear the road." The lead rider, a man with a scarred face and cold eyes, nudged his horse forward a few steps. "We're here for the woman, Elena Whitmore. Hand her over, and nobody needs to get hurt." Elena Whitmore is a federal witness under official protection. You're interfering with federal business. Last chance to clear out before we arrest you for obstruction. The scarred man laughed. "You got 8 men, Marshal. We got 6 here, and another dozen waiting in those trees. You really want to test those odds over one woman?" Ethan felt Helena's hand find his, her fingers ice cold despite the warm morning. This was it. The confrontation they'd been dreading, the moment where Martin Grayson's reach finally caught up with them. "Here's what's going to happen," Thornton said, his voice carrying across the empty space between them. "You're going to turn around and ride away. We're going to continue to Helena. And if you're smart, you'll keep riding until you're far outside this territory, because when we get to that courthouse, I'm issuing warrants for every single one of you for murder of a federal courier and attempted kidnapping of a federal witness. Big words, Marshal, but words don't stop bullets." Thornton's marshals spread out slightly, creating clear lines of fire. Ethan saw them calculating angles, assessing cover, preparing for violence with the calm professionalism of men who'd been in similar situations before. "You kill federal officers, you hang," Thornton said. "All of you. No matter how much money Grayson's paying, it's not worth dying for." For a long moment, nobody moved. The two groups faced each other across 50 yards of Montana dirt road, tension thick enough to choke on. Ethan could hear Helena's shallow breathing, could feel his own heart hammering against his ribs. Then one of the riders in the trees made a mistake, shifted position too obviously, revealing his location. One of Thornton's marshals swung his rifle that direction, and suddenly everyone was moving. "Down!" Ethan yanked Helena from her horse just as gunfire erupted. The world exploded into chaos. Bullets whined through the air where they'd been sitting seconds before. Horses screamed and scattered. Men shouted and returned fire, the thunder of gunshots echoing off the surrounding hills. Ethan covered Helena with his body as they hit the ground hard, rolling behind their panicked horses for cover. Around them, the marshals fought with disciplined precision, firing in controlled volleys while maintaining their defensive positions. "The trees!" someone shouted. "They're flanking left!" More gunfire. Closer now. Ethan risked a glance over his horse's flank and saw riders emerging from the forest exactly as the scarred man had threatened. Not a dozen, but close. Maybe 10 more men, all firing as they charged. Thornton's voice cut through the chaos. "Jackson! Martinez! Take the left flank! Roberts! Stay with the witnesses!" A young marshal dropped beside Ethan and Helena, his rifle already raised and firing. "Stay down!" he ordered. "This'll be over soon." But it didn't feel like it would be over soon. It felt like the beginning of a massacre. Federal marshals outnumbered 2-to-1 by hired guns who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from silencing the witnesses to Grayson's fraud. Then Ethan heard something that changed everything. New gunfire, but from a different direction. Behind Grayson's men, from the forest they'd emerged from. Shouts of confusion and alarm from the attackers as they suddenly found themselves caught between two forces. "Cavalry!" one of the marshals shouted, and Ethan saw them. A full company of U.S. cavalry, riding hard from the north, their officer leading the charge with his saber raised. The battle turned in seconds. Grayson's hired guns, seeing themselves surrounded and vastly outnumbered, broke and ran. Some tried to fight, and fell under the combined fire of marshals and cavalry. Others threw down their weapons and surrendered, hands raised high as cavalry troopers surrounded them. The scarred man tried to run, spurring his horse toward the southern tree line. But Thornton's rifle cracked once, and the man fell from his saddle, clutching his shoulder. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the shooting stopped. Ethan's ears rang in the sudden silence. Smoke drifted across the road from dozens of discharged weapons. He stayed covering Helena until Marshal Roberts nodded that it was safe, then helped her to her feet. "Are you hurt?" Ethan demanded, checking her over frantically. No, I'm fine." Helena was shaking but unharmed. "What happened? Where did the cavalry come from?" The cavalry officer rode forward, a captain in his mid-30s with a dust-covered uniform and a satisfied expression. "Marshal Thornton, your message reached Fort McKenzie this morning. Colonel Andrews sent me and 50 men to provide escort." "Your timing is impeccable, Captain Walsh." Thornton was reloading his rifle, calm as if he'd just finished a routine patrol rather than a gunfight. "We had intelligence that Grayson might try something, but I wasn't expecting this many guns." Desperate men do desperate things. Walsh surveyed the scene. 3 of Grayson's men dead, 7 wounded, the rest captured. "Looks like we wrapped this up nicely. The prisoners are secured, and we're ready to escort you the rest of the way to Helena." With 50 cavalry troopers added to their party, the journey to Helena became a military procession. Grayson's captured men rode in chains, the wounded tended by a cavalry surgeon, the dead wrapped and secured for burial. Ethan and Helena rode in the center of the formation, surrounded by so many armed men that further attack seemed impossible. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Martin Grayson had one more card to play. A man who'd built an empire on stolen money and murder wouldn't give up just because his hired guns failed. He'd find another way, another angle, another method to silence the witnesses and destroy the evidence. They reached Helena late that afternoon, the territorial capital rising from the plains like an island of civilization in an ocean of wilderness. The federal courthouse dominated the center of town, an imposing stone structure that represented justice and law in a place where both were often in short supply. Marshal Thornton led them directly to the courthouse, where the federal prosecutor was waiting with a team of lawyers and clerks. Theodore Marsh was 50 years old, with the sharp eyes and commanding presence of a man who'd spent his career fighting corruption in difficult territories. "Mrs. Rowe," he said, shaking Helena's hand firmly, "your evidence arrived yesterday afternoon and has already sparked a firestorm in Philadelphia. Martin Grayson is currently fighting multiple arrest warrants and injunctions freezing his assets. His bank is under federal investigation, and several of his associates have already fled the city." "He posted bail," Helena reminded him. "He's still free. For now. But I filed emergency motions to revoke that bail based on the attack on your party this morning. Judge Harrison is reviewing them now." Marsh gestured for them to follow him into the courthouse. "In the meantime, we need to get your full testimony on record and secure the original journal. The more evidence we lock down, the harder it becomes for Grayson to escape justice." They spent the next 4 hours in a courthouse conference room, giving detailed statements to stenographers while Marsh asked question after question. Helena walked them through Richard's investigation, the discovered fraud, his murder, her flight west. Ethan corroborated everything he could, adding details about the fake marshals and the attempts to arrest or kill Helena. As evening fell, a clerk rushed in with news. "Mr. Marsh, Judge Harrison has ruled. Bail is revoked. Federal marshals are moving to arrest Grayson now." "How long before we know if they got him?" Marsh asked. "Telegraph should come through within the hour." They raided his home at 4 o'clock Eastern Time, about 30 minutes ago. The wait was excruciating. They moved to Marsh's office, where a telegraph operator had set up equipment for direct communication with Philadelphia. Helena paced while Ethan sat watching her, both of them too tense to speak. Finally, the telegraph began clicking. The operator transcribed quickly, then handed the message to Marsh. The prosecutor read it, and his expression darkened. "Grayson's gone. House was empty, servants dismissed. Looks like he fled sometime this morning, probably right after he heard about the attack on your party failing. So he's still out there," Helena said quietly. "Still free, still dangerous. But significantly less powerful," Marsh countered. "His bank accounts are frozen, his assets seized. The Philadelphia Trust and Loan is under federal control. We've arrested 17 of his known associates. Yes, Grayson himself escaped, but his empire is crumbling. Crumbling empires can still kill people, Ethan said, especially people who help tear them down. Marsh didn't argue the point. Instead, he laid out the security arrangements. Helena and Ethan would stay in protected quarters within the courthouse complex until the trial, which would likely take place in 3 to 4 months. Armed guards, restricted access, every precaution against another attempt on their lives. It's not perfect, Marsh admitted, but it's the best protection we can offer until Grayson is captured or killed. That night, lying in a narrow bed in a courthouse guest room with guards posted outside their door, Helena finally let herself cry. Not from fear or despair, but from exhaustion and relief, and the overwhelming weight of 4 years spent running finally lifting from her shoulders. Ethan held her, saying nothing, letting her release everything she'd been holding back. When the tears finally stopped, she looked up at him in the darkness. "I'm sorry," she said. "You married me to save your family's ranch, and instead you got dragged into a war against a criminal empire." "The ranch is safe," Ethan replied. "My father's debt was cleared. That's what I married you for, and that worked out fine. But everything else was my choice. Helping you fight back, protecting the evidence, standing with you when those men came. I chose all of that, Helena. Nobody forced me." She was quiet for a moment. "Why did you choose it? Really?" Ethan thought about that, about the young man who'd stood in a church 4 days ago, bitter and resentful, trading his future for his family's survival. About how that bitterness had transformed into something else entirely when faced with a woman who'd sacrificed everything to expose corruption and protect evidence that could help thousands of people. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because somewhere in the middle of all this chaos, I stopped seeing you as the woman I was forced to marry and started seeing you as someone worth fighting for." Helena's breath caught. "Ethan, I'm not saying I'm in love with you. We barely know each other. But I respect you, Helena. I admire your courage, your intelligence, your refusal to stay silent about injustice, even when staying silent would have been safer. That's worth fighting for." She kissed him then, soft and tentative, a question more than a statement. Ethan kissed her back, and for the first time since they'd met, the kiss felt like a beginning rather than an obligation. The weeks that followed fell into a strange routine. Days spent with prosecutors and lawyers, reviewing evidence and preparing testimony. Evenings in the courthouse quarters, reading from Helena's extensive collection of books, or talking about lives and dreams and all the things they'd never had time to discuss before. Slowly, carefully, they learned each other. Ethan discovered that Helena had taught mathematics at a private girls' school before marrying Richard. That she played piano beautifully, but hadn't touched one since her first husband died because the music reminded her of happier times. That she took her coffee black and her eggs scrambled and read philosophy texts the way most people read popular novels. Helena learned that Ethan had dreamed of being a veterinarian before his father's gambling destroyed those plans. That he could quote poetry from memory despite never finishing formal schooling. That he was kind without being soft, strong without being cruel. Everything Richard Vance had never been. News from Philadelphia arrived in regular telegrams. Grayson remained at large, but his network was systematically dismantled. Banks across 3 territories returned stolen development funds. Schools were built with money that had been diverted years ago. Wells were dug, irrigation systems installed, all the infrastructure that should have existed if the fraud had never happened. Families like Ethan's benefited directly. A telegram from his father brought news that federal development funds had finally arrived in their county, money for ranch improvements and equipment that would make their lives significantly easier. "Your sacrifice saved more than just our ranch," his father had written. "You saved hundreds of families by helping expose Grayson's theft. We're proud of you, son." The trial was set for late December, 3 months after their arrival in Helena. Walter Green arrived 2 weeks early, carrying completed copies of Richard's journal to be entered as evidence. He also brought news from Copper Falls. "Calvin Drayton is under investigation," Green reported over dinner at the courthouse. Turns out he had connections to Grayson's network, helping identify desperate families who might be vulnerable to loan schemes and land grabs. Federal auditors are going through his records now. "My father's debt," Ethan said slowly. You think Drayton engineered that somehow? I think Drayton knew your father gambled and made sure he was in the right poker game at the right time with enough liquor and bad luck to lose everything. Classic setup. Green sipped his wine. Can't prove it yet, but the pattern is there. He did the same thing to at least 6 other families in the county. Helena's hand found Ethan's under the table. So this whole thing, our marriage, everything that happened, that was Drayton's manipulation from the start? Possibly, though I doubt he expected you to have evidence of federal fraud. That was just fortune smiling on justice. Green pulled out a newspaper. Speaking of which, the Denver Post picked up the story. Front page coverage of the fraud scheme, the trial, the dramatic rescue by cavalry. You two are famous. The newspaper article was sensational, painting Helena as a brave widow who'd risked everything to expose corruption and Ethan as the noble young man who'd stood by her despite impossible odds. It wasn't entirely accurate, but it wasn't entirely wrong either. Fame is dangerous, Helena said quietly. It makes us visible, makes us targets. It also makes you harder to kill quietly, Green countered. Grayson can't make you disappear now without the whole country knowing who's responsible. That's its own form of protection. The trial began on a cold December morning with snow falling outside the courthouse windows. The prosecution had built an overwhelming case using Richard's journal, corroborating bank records, testimony from clerks who'd unknowingly processed fraudulent transactions, and detailed forensic accounting that laid bare 6 years of systematic theft. Helena took the stand on the second day, and Ethan watched from the gallery as she dismantled Grayson's defense with precise, devastating testimony. She walked the jury through every step of how the fraud worked, how Richard had discovered it, how his murder had been disguised as natural causes. The defense tried to discredit her, tried to paint her as an embezzler and liar, but the mountain of evidence was insurmountable. When they challenged the authenticity of the journal, the prosecution produced 3 handwriting experts who confirmed it was Richard Vance's writing. When they questioned Helena's timeline, Sarah Morrison and Reverend Collins testified to confirm her presence in Montana during the alleged theft. On the 5th day, something extraordinary happened. Thomas Brennan, the clerk Helena had mentioned weeks ago, appeared as a surprise prosecution witness. He'd been found by federal investigators, convinced to testify, and his insider knowledge of the bank's operations filled in every remaining gap in the case. I didn't know what I was doing, Brennan testified, his voice shaking. Mr. Grayson told me these were routine transfers, that everything was properly authorized, but Richard Vance showed me the truth, showed me how the numbers didn't match, how money was disappearing. I was terrified, so I kept quiet. And Richard died because I was a coward. His testimony was devastating. By the time he finished, several jury members were openly angry, glaring at the defense table where Grayson's associates sat. Grayson himself remained absent, a fugitive whose empty chair became its own form of condemnation. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Grayson's associates were sentenced to prison terms ranging from 10 to 25 years. Warrants remained active for Grayson himself, along with a substantial reward for information leading to his capture. The Philadelphia Trust and Loan was dissolved, its assets distributed to repay the stolen development funds and compensate victims of the fraud. It was over. They stayed in Helena through Christmas, waiting for the security situation to stabilize. On Christmas Eve, Ethan and Helena sat in their quarters watching snow fall outside the window, the courthouse quiet except for guards making their rounds. What happens now? Helena asked. We can't stay here forever. We could go back to Copper Falls. Your house is still there, your land. Helena shook her head. Too many memories, too many ghosts. Richard, the fear, all those years of hiding. I don't think I could be happy there. Then where? She turned to face him, and Ethan saw hope and fear mingled in her expression. There's a teaching position available in Denver. Girls' Academy, Mathematics and Philosophy. They wrote to me after the trial, said they'd followed my testimony in the newspapers and were impressed by my education and courage. Denver is far from Montana. Yes, far from the past, far from the people who know me as the woman who brought down Martin Grayson. A chance to start over completely. She paused. The letter mentioned they could accommodate a married couple. They have faculty housing, and they're always looking for people who can teach practical subjects, ranch management, animal husbandry, that sort of thing. Ethan felt something shift in his chest. You want me to come with you? I want us to have a real marriage, if that's something you'd want too. Not forced by debt or circumstance, but chosen freely because we actually care about each other. Helena's hands twisted together nervously. These past 3 months, getting to know you, seeing who you really are beyond the arrangement that brought us together. Ethan, I think we could build something real, something good, if you're willing to try. He thought about the ranch in Copper Falls, about the life he'd expected to live before his father's gambling changed everything. He thought about the debt that had been paid, the family legacy that had been saved, all the obligations that had been fulfilled. And then he thought about the woman in front of him. Brilliant, brave, complicated, scarred by a bad first marriage, but still willing to risk her heart again. A woman who'd spent 4 years running, but had finally found a place to stand and fight. A woman who'd married him out of desperation, but was now choosing him freely. I'd like that, Ethan said. I'd like that very much. Helena's smile was radiant, transforming her face from stern elegance to genuine joy. She kissed him, and this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just two people choosing each other against all odds. They left for Denver in early January carrying letters of recommendation and a story that would follow them for years. The scandal of Martin Grayson's fraud continued to unfold in newspapers across the country, with new revelations and arrests almost weekly. But Ethan and Helena were no longer at the center of it, having given their testimony and moved on to build new lives. The Girls' Academy in Denver welcomed them warmly. Helena taught mathematics and philosophy to young women eager to learn from someone who'd proven that intelligence and courage could topple empires. Ethan taught practical skills, but also began studying veterinary medicine at night, finally pursuing the dream he'd set aside years ago. They bought a small house near the academy, filled it with books and music, learned to be married not because they had to, but because they wanted to. It wasn't always easy. Helena had nightmares about Richard's death. Ethan struggled with feeling inadequate compared to her education. But they worked through it together, building trust slowly, carefully, like constructing something precious that needed to last. 6 months after settling in Denver, they received news that Martin Grayson had been found dead in a boarding house in San Francisco. Shot by an unknown assailant, possibly one of his own former associates angry about being imprisoned while he remained free. The case was closed without much investigation, and neither Ethan nor Helena felt particularly sorry about it. Justice, it seemed, found its own paths. A year after the trial, Walter Green published a comprehensive account of the fraud case, the investigation, and the trial. It became a bestseller, exposing the methods of financial corruption and inspiring reforms in how federal development funds were distributed and monitored. Green sent Ethan and Helena a signed copy with a note. "Thank you for letting me be part of something that mattered. You changed more than you know." And he was right. The Grayson case led to new oversight laws, stricter banking regulations, and increased federal attention to territorial development. Schools were built, wells were dug, families prospered with the money that should have reached them years earlier. The ripple effects of Helena's courage and Ethan's loyalty spread far beyond anything they'd imagined. Ethan's family thrived with the development funds finally reaching their county. His father stopped gambling entirely, sobered by how close he'd come to destroying everything. His mother wrote long letters about the improvements they'd made to the ranch, the new equipment they'd purchased, the relief of finally having financial stability. And Calvin Drayton was eventually convicted of fraud himself, his schemes to manipulate vulnerable families exposed by the same federal investigation that had taken down Grayson. The ranch Drayton had tried to steal through Ethan's forced marriage remained firmly in the Rowe family, a small justice that felt deeply satisfying. 3 years after that morning in the Copper Falls church, Ethan and Helena sat on the porch of their Denver home watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Helena's hand rested on her slightly rounded belly, the first child they'd conceived, not from obligation, but from love. "Do you ever regret it?" Helena asked quietly. "Marrying me that day? Everything that followed?" Ethan thought about the question, about the young man he'd been, bitter and resentful, feeling like his life was being stolen by circumstances beyond his control. about the journey that had transformed a forced marriage into genuine partnership, about the battles fought and won, about the life they'd built together. "No," he said honestly. "I regret what my father did, the debt that made the marriage necessary. But I don't regret marrying you. Everything good in my life now, the teaching, the studying, this," he gestured at the home they'd made together. "None of it would exist if I'd walked away from that arrangement. You could have had all of this with someone you chose yourself, someone younger, someone who didn't bring danger and federal fraud cases as a dowry. Maybe. But I wouldn't have had you. Wouldn't have learned what real courage looks like, or what it means to stand up against corruption even when it's terrifying, or how to build something beautiful from circumstances that started out forced and complicated." Ethan took her hand. "You taught me that sacrifice can become choice, that duty can become love, that the things we're forced into can sometimes lead us exactly where we need to be." Helena leaned against him, watching the sunset together. "We were an unlikely pair. We still are. Professor of mathematics married to a veterinary student 15 years younger. People still talk. Let them talk. We know what we built, what we survived, what we chose." They sat in comfortable silence as the light faded, two people who'd started as strangers bound by debt and desperation, who'd fought together against corruption and murder, who'd learned to choose each other freely despite everything that should have kept them apart. The land stretched out before them, wide and open and full of possibility, belonging to them not because of debt or obligation or desperation, but because they'd fought for it together, because they'd transformed a transaction into a partnership, an arrangement into a marriage, sacrifice into something that looked remarkably like love. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Ethan realized that the noose he'd felt tightening around his neck that morning in Copper Falls had never been a noose at all. It had been a lifeline, pulling him toward a future he'd never imagined but couldn't imagine living without now. Behind them, through the open door, they could hear the piano Helena had finally bought, the music she'd finally allowed herself to play again. Ahead of them lay years of teaching and learning, of raising children, and building a life that honored the sacrifices that had brought them together while creating something entirely their own. The debt had been paid. The corruption had been exposed. The criminals had faced justice. And two people who'd married for all the wrong reasons had found all the right ones to stay together. In the end, that was the story worth telling. Not the fraud, or the trial, or the dramatic rescues, but the quiet miracle of two strangers becoming partners, allies, and eventually something that looked remarkably like home. The Montana Territory stretched vast and beautiful around them, and for the first time since that morning in the church, Ethan Rowe felt completely, utterly free.